Good evening, dear listener. Tonight we return once again to the forgotten folds of history, in search of moments that shape the world in quiet ways. Whether you're cozy in bed or listening with closed eyes, I'm glad you're spending this peaceful time here. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Are you just waking up, or about to drift off with the past whispering in your ear? If you're enjoying these calm passages through time, please do subscribe. There are many more nights like this ahead. Tonight to reveal the shocking truth about laudanum addiction among Victorian society women, a crisis so widespread it touched nearly every drawing room in Britain, yet remained hidden beneath layers of propriety and shame. We'll uncover how this seemingly innocent medicine became the gateway to destruction for countless mothers, wives, and daughters of the upper classes. But first, let me show you just how pervasive this problem really was, because the statistics will absolutely astound you. In 1860s, Britain, laudanum was available without prescription at any pharmacy, grocery store, or even street vendor. It was cheaper than gin and considered far more respectable. Medical professionals prescribed it for everything from headaches to heartbreak, and society women consumed it by the thousands of bottles each week. What makes this story even more remarkable is how these women maintained their reputations while battling an addiction that would have scandalized society if it had been fully understood. My name is your host, and I've spent years studying the hidden histories of addiction and medicine. The story I'm about to tell you has been buried in private letters, medical journals, and family secrets for over a century. These are the true accounts of women whose addiction to laudanum shaped not just their own lives, but the entire fabric of Victorian society. Now, you might be thinking that surely Victorian society would have recognized such a widespread problem, but here's where the story gets fascinating. The very qualities that made laudanum so appealing to these women, its ability to provide calm, composure, and relief from the crushing expectations of their social roles, also made their addiction nearly invisible to the outside world. Let me tell you about Catherine Morrison, the wife of a prominent Edinburgh banker. In her private diary, discovered only decades after her death, she wrote with startling honesty about her relationship with laudanum. Catherine began taking small doses in 1868 after the death of her third child in infancy. Her physician recommended it for her nerves, and initially it seemed like a godsend. The crushing weight of grief lifted. Her hands stopped trembling during social calls, and she could once again perform the exhausting theatre of Victorian womanhood. But by 1871, Catherine was consuming nearly 2 ounces of laudanum daily, an amount that would have been shocking even by the liberal standards of the time. Her diary entries reveal the careful choreography required to maintain her supply without arousing suspicion. She would send her maid to different apothecaries across the city, never visiting the same shop twice in 1 week. She kept bottles hidden throughout her house, in hat boxes, beneath floorboards, even sewn into the lining of her winter coats. What's most striking about Catherine's story is how completely she maintained her social facade. Her husband never suspected. Her friends considered her a model of grace under pressure, and she continued hosting elaborate dinner parties and managing a household of 12 servants. The laudanum didn't make her visibly intoxicated like alcohol might have. Instead, it provided what she called her armor of serenity against a world that demanded perfection from its women, while offering them precious little control over their own lives. Catherine's experience was far from unique. Dr. James Patterson, writing in the British Medical Journal in 1883, estimated that nearly 30% of his female patients from the upper classes showed signs of laudanum dependency. But this wasn't seen as a crisis requiring intervention. Instead, it was viewed as an unfortunate but understandable response to the particular stresses faced by women of breeding and sensitivity. The reasons these women turned to laudanum reveal the suffocating constraints of Victorian society. Consider the case of Margaret Ashford, a 32-year-old mother of 6 from Manchester. Margaret's letters to her sister paint a picture of relentless pressure that would be familiar to many women throughout history, but was particularly acute in an era that demanded absolute submission to social expectations. Margaret's days began at 5 in the morning with prayer and meditation, followed by overseeing the servants, managing the household accounts, receiving callers, supervising her children's education, and maintaining correspondence with dozens of family members and social acquaintances. She was expected to be knowledgeable about literature and current events, but never to express opinions that might challenge male authority. She needed to be physically attractive, but never vain, intellectually capable, but never threatening, emotionally supportive, but never needy. The weight of these expectations, combined with the very real dangers of repeated childbirth, the high rates of infant mortality, and the complete lack of legal or financial independence, created what Margaret described as a constant state of nervous exhaustion that threatens to consume my very soul. When her physician prescribed laudanum for the headaches that plagued her daily, it seemed like a miracle cure. Within months, Margaret discovered that laudanum didn't just ease her physical pain, it provided emotional relief from the crushing weight of her responsibilities. A few drops in her morning tea gave her the strength to face another day of perfect performance. A slightly larger dose helped her maintain her composure during her husband's increasingly frequent business dinners, where she was expected to be charming but invisible, present but silent. What's particularly tragic about Margaret's story is how her laudanum use actually helped her become a better Victorian woman, at least in the eyes of society. Her husband praised her newfound calm, her children found her more patient, and her social circle admired her grace under pressure. The drug that was slowly destroying her was simultaneously helping her meet the impossible standards her world demanded. The medical establishment of the time was complicit in this crisis, though often unknowingly. Dr. Samuel Richardson, a prominent London physician who treated many society women, wrote extensively about what he called female nervous disorders. His recommended treatments almost always included laudanum, which he viewed as particularly suited to the delicate constitutions of upper-class women. Dr. Richardson's case notes, preserved in the Royal College of Physicians archives, reveal his complete misunderstanding of addiction. He wrote about patients like Mrs. Vivian Blackwood, who came to him complaining of insomnia, anxiety, and what she described as a terrible restlessness of spirit. Dr. Richardson diagnosed her with hysteria, a catch-all term for any female complaint that couldn't be easily categorized, and prescribed increasingly large doses of laudanum. When Mrs. Blackwood returned, month after month requesting stronger preparations, Dr. Richardson saw this not as evidence of dependency, but as proof of her refined sensitivity. He believed that women of breeding simply required more delicate treatment than their working-class counterparts, and that their need for laudanum was a sign of their superior nervous organization rather than evidence of addiction. This medical attitude created a perfect storm for widespread dependency. Women who might have been alarmed by their increasing need for laudanum were reassured by their physicians that their consumption was not only normal, but evidence of their refined nature. The shame that might have encouraged them to seek help was replaced by a sense of almost aristocratic distinction. The economic factors surrounding laudanum also contributed to its widespread use among society women. Unlike alcohol, which was associated with working-class vice and moral failing, laudanum was expensive enough to maintain an aura of respectability. A bottle of high-quality laudanum cost more than a servant's monthly wages, making it a luxury that only the wealthy could afford in large quantities. This economic barrier actually increased laudanum's appeal among the upper classes. Taking laudanum became a subtle form of conspicuous consumption, a way of demonstrating both one's wealth and one's sensitivity. Women would there preferred discussed preparations and suppliers with the same attention to quality and exclusivity that they applied to their dressmakers and jewelers. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, the wife of a textile magnate, kept detailed records of her laudanum purchases that read like a connoisseur's guide to fine wine. She preferred the preparations made by Harrington and Sons of Bond Street, particularly their elixir of tranquility, which she described as having a particularly smooth action that provides relief without the crude stupor associated with inferior preparations. Adelaide's consumption records show a steady increase from 2 bottles per month in 1874 to nearly 15 bottles per month by 1878. Yet she never viewed this escalation as problematic, instead seeing it as evidence of her developing sophistication in matters of pharmaceutical refinement. Her letters to friends contain recommendations for various preparations, discussions of optimal dosing schedules, and warnings about inferior products, all couched in the language of genteel consumer advice rather than addiction management. The social networks surrounding laudanum use created their own form of enabling community. Women would share suppliers, exchange dosing advice, and provide emotional support for what they viewed as a shared challenge of maintaining composure in a demanding world. These informal networks operated much like modern support groups, except they supported continued use rather than recovery. Lady Charlotte Fairfax hosted what she called her Thursday Remedies Circle in the lavish morning room of her Mayfair townhouse. To any observer, these weekly gatherings appeared to be nothing more than refined ladies enjoying afternoon tea while discussing literature and charitable works. But beneath the surface of polite conversation about the latest Dickens novel or fundraising for the local orphanage, something far more significant was taking place. Charlotte and her circle of 8 intimate friends had developed an elaborate system for sharing information about laudanum preparations, reliable suppliers, and what they euphemistically called dosing strategies for optimal feminine composure. Mrs. Beatrice Harrington would arrive each Thursday with samples of new preparations from her husband's pharmaceutical connections. Lady Penelope Ashworth contributed detailed notes about which combinations work best for different social situations. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell shared techniques for concealing the telltale signs of heavy laudanum use, from makeup tricks to hide the pinpoint pupils, to breathing exercises that masked the drug's sedating effects. These women genuinely believed they were helping each other navigate the impossible demands of their social position. They saw their Thursday meetings as acts of sisterly support, providing practical solutions for maintaining the perfection expected of Victorian ladies. When Charlotte began requiring larger doses to achieve the same calming effects, her friends didn't recognize this as tolerance building towards serious addiction. Instead, they interpreted it as evidence that Charlotte was facing particularly challenging circumstances that demanded more sophisticated pharmaceutical support. The group developed an intricate code for discussing their laudanum use in public settings. They would speak of taking their medicine or consulting Dr. Harrington's recommendations when they meant consuming laudanum. Different preparations had elaborate nicknames like Lady Margaret's Comfort or the Earl Grey Blend. Doses were discussed in terms of teaspoons of honey or drops of lemon, creating a vocabulary that allowed them to share detailed consumption advice even in mixed company without arousing suspicion. This coded language extended beyond their immediate circle and became part of a broader underground communication network among society women throughout London. A lady might casually mention at a dinner party that she had been following Lady Charlotte's honey recommendations and immediately identify herself to other laudanum users in attendance. These subtle signals created bonds between women who might otherwise have little in common, united by their shared dependence on the drug that made their restricted lives bearable. The sophistication of these social networks reveals just how deeply laudanum had penetrated the highest levels of British society. Women who controlled vast household budgets, managed complex social calendars, and wielded considerable behind-the-scenes political influence applied the same organizational skills to maintaining their drug supply and supporting other users. They created backup systems for procurement, developed rotation schedules to avoid suspicion from individual pharmacists, and even established emergency sharing protocols for situations when regular supplies were interrupted. Mrs. Constance Worthington exemplified the tragic irony of how laudanum addiction could actually enhance a woman's social standing while destroying her physical and mental health. Constance was renowned throughout London society for her unflappable demeanour during even the most challenging social situations. When her husband's business partner embezzled a fortune, leaving the family facing potential bankruptcy and social disgrace, Constance maintained such perfect composure that she became a legend among her peers. What society didn't know consuming was that Constance was nearly 4 ounces of laudanum daily during this crisis, an amount that would have been lethal for someone without her built-up tolerance. Her famous calm wasn't strength of character, but chemical suppression of natural human emotion. Her ability to smile graciously while receiving condolences for her family's misfortune, to host elegant dinner parties while creditors circled, and to maintain perfect posture and pleasant conversation while her world collapsed around her, was entirely dependent on massive doses of opium-based medication. Constance's private letters to her sister reveal the horrifying reality behind her public triumph. She described feeling like she was watching my life from a great distance, as though observing someone else's tragedy through thick glass. She wrote about losing entire days to laudanum stupors, only to wake and discover that she had somehow successfully navigated complex social obligations with no memory of the events. Her famous grace under pressure was actually a form of chemically induced dissociation that allowed her to function while being completely disconnected from her own experience. The physical toll of heavy laudanum use was devastating, though Victorian women became experts at concealing the symptoms. Mrs. Helena Blackwood's diary entries chronicle her deteriorating health over 5 years of increasing laudanum consumption. She described chronic constipation so severe that she sometimes went 2 weeks without bowel movements, leading to excruciating abdominal pain that she treated with even more laudanum. Her skin became sallow and took on a waxy appearance that she covered with increasingly heavy applications of rouge and powder. Helena's teeth began falling out from the drug's effects on her calcium absorption, forcing her to avoid social situations that involved eating. She developed what she called the trembling sickness, uncontrollable shaking that would strike without warning whenever her laudanum levels dropped too low. Most frightening of all, she began experiencing what modern medicine would recognize as withdrawal-induced hallucinations, seeing shadowy figures in her peripheral vision and hearing voices calling her name from empty rooms. Yet even as Helena's health deteriorated, she continued to be praised by society for her ethereal beauty and otherworldly grace. The very symptoms that were destroying her were interpreted by others as signs of refined sensibility and artistic temperament. Her weight loss was admired as fashionable slenderness, her pale complexion was seen as aristocratic delicacy, and her increasingly distant demeanour was praised as mysterious sophistication. The children of these addicted women paid a terrible price that has been largely overlooked by historical accounts. Young Lady Margaret Pemberton grew up in a household where her mother's laudanum addiction created an atmosphere of unpredictable emotional availability. Margaret's childhood letters to her governess describe a mother who could be wonderfully attentive and affectionate in the morning, then completely unreachable by afternoon, staring into space with glassy eyes and responding to questions with vacant smiles. These children learned to read the subtle signs that indicated their mother's laudanum levels and adjusted their behavior accordingly. They knew which times of day were best for requesting permissions or confiding troubles, which facial expressions meant mother was taking her medicine, and how to manage household crises when their primary caregiver was chemically incapacitated. Many developed premature maturity and caretaking behaviors, essentially parenting their own parents, while maintaining the facade of a normal upper-class childhood. The servants in these households became unwilling accomplices in maintaining the family's reputation while enabling their mistress's addiction. Mary Fletcher worked as a lady's maid for Mrs. Arabella Thornton for 12 years, and her oral history, recorded late in life, provides a servant's perspective on the laudanum crisis. Mary described the elaborate routines she developed to help her mistress function while heavily medicated. Mary would arrive each morning to find Mrs. Thornton in various states of laudanum stupor and would need to assess how much assistance would be required to prepare her for the day's social obligations. On days when Mrs. Thornton had taken particularly large doses, Mary would need to physically dress her like a child, apply her makeup while she dozed, and even manipulate her mistress's mouth into appropriate shapes, while coaching her through conversations with visiting callers. The servants developed their own network of information sharing about managing laudanum-addicted employers. They knew which households faced similar challenges and would share strategies for everything from preventing their mistresses from injuring themselves during stupors to covering for missed social engagements with believable excuses. These working-class women often understood the true nature of their employer's condition far better than the addicted women themselves, yet they were powerless to intervene and bound by employment loyalty to maintain the fiction of normalcy. The financial drain of heavy laudanum consumption created its own set of problems that further complicated these women's lives. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's household account books reveal that by 1876, she was spending more on laudanum than on food for her entire family of 7+ servants. Her monthly pharmaceutical expenses exceeded her clothing allowance, her charitable donations, and even her entertainment budget combined. To fund her escalating habit, Cordelia began what she euphemistically called household economies, gradually selling valuable items from her home and replacing them with less expensive alternatives. She sold her grandmother's silver tea service and replaced it with silver-plated pieces, pawned her collection of first-edition books and substituted cheaper reprints, and even sold pieces of her jewellery while telling her husband they were being cleaned or repaired. These financial manipulations required considerable cunning and created additional layers of deception that further isolated these women from their families and friends. Cordelia developed elaborate stories to explain missing valuables, forged her husband's signature on bank drafts, and even borrowed money from tradesmen against future payments for household goods. The shame and fear of discovery added another dimension of stress to lives already overwhelmed by the physical and psychological effects of addiction. The medical community's response to obvious cases of laudanum dependency reveals the profound gender bias and medical ignorance of the era. Dr. Edward Whitmore treated dozens of society women for what he termed nervous exhaustion complicated by pharmaceutical sensitivity. His case notes describe patients who clearly displayed classic signs of opiate addiction, but were treated as suffering from uniquely feminine disorders, requiring continued medication rather than withdrawal and recovery. When Mrs. Isabella Crawford came to Dr. Whitmore complaining that her usual laudanum dose no longer provided relief and requesting stronger preparations, he didn't recognize this as tolerance requiring intervention. Instead, he diagnosed her with progressive nervous refinement and prescribed an even more potent opium-based compound. His notes describe Isabella's condition as evidence of her superior breeding and sensitivity, noting that ladies of the finest sensibilities naturally require more delicate pharmaceutical support than their coarser-natured sisters. This medical blindness extended throughout the healthcare establishment, creating a system that actively perpetuated addiction while claiming to treat it. Dr. Whitmore's colleague, Dr. Reginald Hartwell, published a paper in 1879 titled The Management of Feminine Nervous Complaints, in which he argued that society women's increasing reliance on laudanum was actually a positive development, demonstrating their refined constitutions and proving that they possessed more delicate nervous systems than working-class women. Dr. Hartwell's research included case studies of 23 patients, all wealthy society women, who consumed what he described as therapeutic quantities of laudanum ranging from 1 to 6 ounces daily. Rather than recognizing these massive doses as dangerous, he praised his patients for their pharmaceutical sophistication and recommended that other physicians encourage similar consumption patterns among their upper-class female clientele. The tragic case of Mrs. Evangeline Blackthorne illustrates how this medical approach could prove fatal. Evangeline began taking laudanum in 1872 following a difficult childbirth that left her with chronic pain. Her physician, Dr. Marcus Fieldstone, prescribed increasingly powerful opium preparations as her tolerance grew, viewing her escalating needs as evidence of her aristocratic sensitivity rather than dangerous addiction. By 1875, Evangeline was consuming nearly 8 ounces of laudanum daily, an amount that required constant monitoring to prevent fatal overdose. Her daily routine became entirely structured around maintaining precise dosing schedules to avoid both withdrawal symptoms and accidental poisoning. She carried a small gold watch that chimed every 2 hours, signaling time for her next dose, and employed a personal maid whose sole responsibility was managing her medication schedule. Evangeline's husband, Colonel Blackthorne, remained completely unaware of his wife's condition despite living in the same house. She had become so skilled at concealing her addiction that she could maintain normal conversations and social interactions even while heavily medicated. Her servants were instructed to never disturb her between doses. Her social calendar was carefully arranged around her medication needs, and she had developed techniques for appearing alert and engaged, even during periods of near unconsciousness. The end came suddenly during a winter evening in 1876. Evangeline's regular supplier had provided a batch of laudanum that was significantly more potent than usual, but neither she nor her maid recognized the difference. Following her normal evening routine, Evangeline consumed her standard dose and retired to her chambers. When her maid arrived the following morning, she found her mistress had died peacefully in her sleep, the victim of an accidental overdose that was recorded officially as heart failure to protect the family's reputation. Colonel Blackthorne never learned the true cause of his wife's death. The family physician, Dr. Fieldstone, attributed her passing to the same feminine nervous exhaustion that had supposedly required her laudanum treatment, creating a neat circular explanation that protected everyone's reputation while obscuring the real tragedy. Evangeline was buried with full honors as a beloved wife and mother, her true struggle remaining a secret shared only by her servants and supplier. The economic networks that supported the laudanum trade among society women created their own form of parallel economy. Mrs. Penelope Ashford discovered that her increasing consumption was straining even her considerable household budget, so she began what she called pharmaceutical entrepreneurship, purchasing laudanum in bulk quantities and selling portions to other society women at markup prices that covered her own consumption. Penelope's business operated through her extensive social connections, with transactions disguised as normal social exchanges. A lady calling for afternoon tea might leave with a small package hidden in her reticule, paying for her purchase through apparently innocent gifts of expensive perfume, rare books, or jewelry. Penelope maintained detailed records using an elaborate code that disguised drug transactions as charitable donations, making her appear exceptionally generous while actually documenting a thriving underground pharmaceutical business. This informal drug dealing among society women created webs of mutual dependency that went far beyond simple friendship. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton became indebted to Penelope not just financially, but socially, as any disruption in their relationship could mean loss of access to her laudanum supply. These relationships gave certain women considerable power over their peers, creating hierarchies within society circles that had nothing to do with traditional markers of status like family lineage or husband's position. The children growing up in these households developed sophisticated understanding of their mother's conditions without ever having vocabulary to name what they were witnessing. Young William Ashworth wrote in his school essays about his mother's afternoon rests and morning medicines, describing in innocent detail the elaborate rituals surrounding her laudanum consumption. His compositions reveal a child who had learned to navigate around his mother's addiction while maintaining complete ignorance about its true nature. William's letters home from boarding school show his confusion about his mother's increasingly erratic correspondence. Sometimes she would write long, rambling letters filled with excessive emotion and elaborate declarations of love, clearly composed during periods of heavy laudanum use. Other times, her letters would be brief and distant, written during periods when she was attempting to reduce her consumption and experiencing withdrawal symptoms that left her irritable and detached. The boarding school system actually served as a protective buffer for many children of addicted society women, removing them from households where their mothers' conditions were deteriorating while maintaining the fiction that they were simply receiving proper upper-class education. Masters at these schools learned to recognize certain signs that indicated problems at home, such as students who displayed unusual anxiety about holiday visits or who seemed reluctant to discuss their families. The seasonal patterns of society life created particular challenges for women managing laudanum addiction. The London social season, with its relentless schedule of balls, dinner parties, theatre evenings, and charitable events, required enormous stamina and constant performance of gracious perfection. Many women found their laudanum consumption spiking dramatically during these periods, as they struggled to meet the demands of their social obligations. Mrs. Victoria Fairchild's diary entries reveal how the social season became a kind of pharmaceutical endurance test. During the height of the 1878 season, she was attending social events nearly every evening while managing a complex household, overseeing her daughter's debuts into society, and maintaining correspondence with dozens of relatives and friends. Her laudanum consumption during this period reached nearly 10 ounces daily, an amount that left her in a constant state of controlled intoxication. Victoria developed what she called her social dosing strategy, carefully timing her laudanum consumption to provide maximum composure during important events while avoiding obvious intoxication that might cause scandal. She would take smaller doses throughout the day to prevent withdrawal symptoms, then consume larger amounts precisely calculated to peak during evening social events, when perfect performance was most crucial. The precision required for this kind of pharmaceutical management reveals the intelligence and determination these women applied to their addiction. Victoria's calculations had to account for the timing of different social obligations, the duration of various events, her tolerance levels at different times of day, and even factors like whether she would be expected to dance, which required more alertness than simply maintaining conversation during dinner. The religious communities that served upper-class society remained largely blind to the laudanum crisis unfolding among their congregants. Reverend Dr. Marcus Whitfield, who ministered to one of London's most fashionable Anglican parishes, praised the serene demeanour and apparent spiritual devotion of many women who were actually heavily medicated during church services. Mrs. Arabella Thornton became known throughout her parish for her ability to sit motionless during even the longest sermons, her hands folded perfectly in her lap and her expression radiating what appeared to be deep spiritual contemplation. Reverend Whitfield often used her as an example of ideal feminine piety, not realizing that her stillness resulted from laudanum doses large enough to suppress most voluntary movement, while leaving her conscious enough to maintain appropriate posony of laudature. The laudanum-addicted women being held up as models of Christian virtue reveals how completely society misunderstood what was happening in their midst. These women's apparent transcendence of worldly concerns, their patient acceptance of suffering, and their ethereal detachment from material pleasures were actually symptoms of severe drug dependency, rather than evidence of spiritual advancement. The charitable work that occupied much of society women's time became another arena where laudanum addiction played out in complex ways. Mrs. Helena Blackwood served on the board of directors for 3 different charitable organizations, dedicated to helping the poor overcome various forms of vice and addiction, including alcohol dependency. The irony of her position was lost on everyone, including Helena herself, who genuinely believed her own laudanum use was medically necessary rather than recreational addiction. Helena's work with alcoholic women from the working classes actually reinforced her belief that her own situation was fundamentally different. She saw the women seeking charity as morally weak individuals who had chosen vice over virtue, while viewing her own laudanum consumption as sophisticated medical treatment for a refined constitution. This class-based blindness prevented her from recognizing the similarities between her own compulsive drug use and the addiction she was supposedly helping others overcome. The charitable organizations themselves became inadvertent enablers of laudanum addiction among their wealthy benefactors. Board meetings were often scheduled during afternoon hours, when many society women were at peak medication levels, creating an atmosphere where drug-induced calm and detachment were interpreted as wise deliberation and mature judgment. Women who might have seemed obviously intoxicated in other contexts appeared perfectly appropriate in the sedate environment of charitable boardrooms. The international connections of wealthy British families created supply chains for laudanum that extended far beyond London's pharmaceutical establishments. Mrs. Caroline Ashworth maintained correspondence with relatives living in India, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire, all regions where opium was more readily available and significantly less expensive than in Britain. Her letters, preserved in family archives, contain elaborate coded requests for what she termed medicinal supplies and therapeutic preparations. Caroline's international sourcing network allowed her to maintain her addiction even when local supplies became unreliable or expensive. She would arrange for relatives abroad to ship what appeared to be innocent gifts of perfumes, spices, or medicinal herbs, but which actually contained carefully concealed quantities of high-grade opium preparations. These packages would arrive through normal postal channels without arousing suspicion, allowing Caroline to maintain a steady supply regardless of local market conditions. The sophistication of these international smuggling operations, conducted entirely by respectable society women using family connections and social networks, demonstrates how deeply laudanum addiction had penetrated upper-class culture. Women who would have been horrified by any association with criminal activity were unknowingly operating complex drug trafficking networks that spanned continents, all while maintaining their reputations as pillars of moral society. The seasonal migrations of wealthy families between their London townhouses, country estates, and foreign residences created additional logistical challenges for women managing laudanum addiction. Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell's travel preparations required as much planning for her drug supply as for her wardrobe, with elaborate systems for concealing bottles in specially modified luggage and arrangements with suppliers in each location she planned to visit. Beatrice's travel diaries reveal the constant anxiety that accompanied any journey, as she worried about customs inspections, shipping delays, or changes in travel plans that might disrupt her carefully calculated medication schedule. She developed relationships with pharmacists in Edinburgh, Bath, Brighton, and even Paris, creating a network of suppliers that allowed her to maintain her addiction, regardless of where her family's social obligations might take her. The international nature of upper-class social life meant that laudanum addiction among British society women influenced and was influenced by similar patterns in other countries. American heiresses marrying into British aristocracy often brought their own pharmaceutical dependencies with them, while British women living abroad for their husband's business or diplomatic careers encountered different forms of opium-based medications that sometimes proved even more addictive than the laudanum preparations available in London. The cross-cultural exchange of pharmaceutical knowledge among wealthy women created what can only be described as an international sisterhood of addiction. When Lady Margaret Thornfield returned from 3 years in colonial India with her diplomat husband, she brought back not only exotic silks and precious stones, but also knowledge of opium preparations that were far more potent than anything available in British pharmacies. Her drawing room became an informal laboratory where she would demonstrate the preparation of what she called Eastern remedies to fascinated friends who found these foreign concoctions both thrilling and socially acceptable due to their exotic origins. Lady Margaret's Indian connections allowed her to access raw opium that she would dissolve in wine or brandy, creating preparations that were significantly stronger than commercial laudanum while maintaining the veneer of sophisticated international culture. Her Thursday afternoon gatherings became legendary among certain circles, where ladies would sample different cultural preparations while discussing literature and charitable works. These women genuinely believed they were engaging in anthropological study rather than escalating drug experimentation. The influence of these international connections extended beyond individual consumption patterns to shape entire social networks. Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore's correspondence with her sister living in Constantinople reveals how families scattered across the British Empire shared pharmaceutical knowledge and supplies. Cordelia would send her sister British medical journals and pharmaceutical catalogues, while receiving, in return, detailed descriptions of Ottoman medical practices and samples of regional opium preparations that were often far more potent than anything legally available in London. This international drug trafficking, conducted entirely through respectable family channels, created supply chains that were virtually impossible for authorities to detect or interrupt. Women who had never engaged in any form of illegal activity were unknowingly operating sophisticated smuggling networks that moved enormous quantities of narcotics across international borders, all disguised as innocent family correspondence and gift exchanges. The children of these internationally connected families often grew up with an unusually sophisticated understanding of global pharmaceutical markets. Young Henry Ashworth's letters from his grand tour of European capitals contain detailed observations about his mother's meetings with local suppliers in Paris, Vienna, and Rome. He describes these encounters in the innocent language of tourism and cultural exchange, never understanding that his mother was actually expanding her international drug procurement network while ostensibly broadening her cultural horizons. Henry's accounts reveal how addiction shaped even family travel decisions. His mother would insist on extending stays in certain cities where she had discovered particularly reliable suppliers, while cutting short visits to places where her pharmaceutical needs couldn't be easily met. The family's grand tour, supposedly designed to provide Henry with cultural education, was actually structured around maintaining his mother's drug supply across multiple countries. The seasonal patterns of international society created additional opportunities for pharmaceutical networking. The annual migration of wealthy British families to continental spas and resorts brought together women from across Europe and America, all seeking relief from various ailments and many struggling with their own forms of addiction. These international gathering places became informal exchanges where women could share suppliers, compare preparations, and learn about pharmaceutical innovations from different countries. Mrs. Victoria Blackwood's diary entries from her annual visits to Baden-Baden reveal how these spa communities operated as international drug markets disguised as health resorts. Women would arrive claiming to seek treatment for various nervous conditions, but actually spent their time sampling different national approaches to opium-based medicine. Victoria describes elaborate dinner parties where the conversation would focus on comparing German laudanum preparations to French alternatives, Italian opium wines to British pharmaceutical compounds. These international spa communities provided perfect cover for heavy drug consumption, as the medical justification for taking various preparations was built into the spa experience itself. Women could consume enormous quantities of different opiate medications while maintaining the fiction that they were following prescribed medical treatments for legitimate health concerns. The international nature of these communities also provided anonymity that allowed for experimentation with dosages and combinations that might have raised eyebrows in their home social circles. The scientific revolution, beginning to transform medicine in the late Victorian period, created new challenges for women managing laudanum addiction. Dr. Alexander Morrison's 1881 research into opium dependency marked one of the first serious medical attempts to understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing. However, his work focused almost exclusively on male subjects, particularly soldiers who had become dependent on morphine for war injuries, leaving the epidemic among society women largely unstudied and misunderstood. Dr. Morrison's research did reach some progressive physicians who began to recognize addiction patterns among their female patients. Dr. Catherine Whitfield, one of the few women practicing medicine in London during this period, wrote extensively about what she termed domestic pharmaceutical dependency. Her observations, published in small medical journals that reached only a handful of colleagues, provided the first accurate medical description of laudanum addiction among upper-class women. Dr. Whitfield's case studies reveal the sophisticated methods these women use to conceal their conditions from male physicians. Mrs. Isabella Crawford had developed elaborate symptoms that mimicked legitimate medical conditions requiring opium treatment, allowing her to maintain her supply while appearing to seek appropriate medical care. Isabella could produce convincing displays of abdominal pain, nervous tremors, and respiratory distress that exactly matched conditions for which laudanum was commonly prescribed. The deception required considerable medical knowledge and acting skill. Isabella had studied medical texts to understand which symptoms would justify continued opium prescriptions, and she had practiced producing physical signs that would convince physicians of her need for medication. Her performance was so convincing that several male doctors praised her stoic endurance of what they believed to be genuine suffering, never suspecting that her symptoms were carefully manufactured to maintain her drug supply. Dr. Whitfield's attempts to treat addiction among her female patients met with limited success, partly because the social structures that supported these women's drug use remained intact. When she tried to gradually reduce Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's laudanum consumption, Eleanor simply switched to different physicians who were less aware of addiction issues and would provide the prescriptions she needed. The informal networks among society women meant that any doctor attempting to restrict opium access would quickly find their patients seeking care elsewhere. The emerging understanding of addiction as a medical condition created new forms of denial among addicted women, who preferred to view their condition as evidence of superior sensitivity rather than as a disease requiring treatment. Mrs. Charlotte Ashford rejected Dr. Whitfield's diagnosis of pharmaceutical dependency, insisting that her laudanum consumption was a sophisticated form of self-medication that demonstrated her advanced understanding of her own constitution. Charlotte's response illustrates how addiction became integrated with Victorian concepts of feminine refinement and medical sophistication. She genuinely believed that her ability to self-regulate her opium consumption, to maintain social functioning while heavily medicated, and to procure high-quality preparations demonstrated superior breeding and intelligence rather than evidence of comp use. This psychological all-civ drug framework made recovery extremely difficult, as it required abandoning not just the drug, but also the entire self-concept that had developed around its use. The financial mechanisms that supported heavy laudanum consumption among society women created their own forms of economic dependency that complicated any attempts at recovery. Mrs. Arabella Thornton's household accounts reveal that by 1882, her pharmaceutical expenses exceeded the combined salaries of all her domestic servants. To maintain this level of consumption, she had developed elaborate financial arrangements that included borrowing against future inheritance, selling valuable household items, and even taking loans from tradesmen who extended credit based on her family's social position. These financial entanglements meant that reducing laudanum consumption required not just physical and psychological adjustment, but also complete restructuring of household economics. Arabella's addiction had become so expensive that cutting back would have freed up enormous amounts of money, creating questions from her husband about where those funds had been going and potentially exposing the extent of her pharmaceutical dependency. The economic aspects of addiction also created opportunities for exploitation by suppliers who understood their customers' desperation. Mr. James Harrison, who operated a high-end pharmaceutical establishment in Belgravia, kept detailed records of his society clients that reveal systematic price manipulation designed to maximize profits from addicted women. His prices for laudanum preparations increased steadily as individual customers' consumption grew, exploiting their dependency to extract maximum payment. Harrison's business model depended entirely on maintaining his clients' addiction while avoiding any scandal that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or medical professionals. He would provide increasingly potent preparations to customers whose tolerance had grown, ensuring continued dependency while raising prices to reflect the supposed superior quality of his products. His establishment became known among society women as the most reliable and discreet supplier in, creating a London clientele willing to pay premium prices for both pharmaceutical and social protection. The servants working in households affected by laudanum addiction developed their own informal support networks for managing the challenges of serving addicted employers. Mary Patterson, who worked as a lady's maid for Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood, kept detailed notes about managing her mistress's daily routines around pharmaceutical consumption. These notes, discovered decades later, provide an unprecedented servant's perspective on how addiction affected entire households. Mary's documentation reveals the elaborate choreography required to maintain the appearance of normal household functioning while accommodating her mistress's unpredictable states of consciousness. She developed systems for dressing Mrs. Blackwood when she was too sedated to cooperate, techniques for applying makeup that would conceal the physical effects of heavy opium use, and strategies for managing social callers when her employer was too intoxicated to receive visitors safely. The servant networks extended beyond individual households to create informal communication systems that allowed domestic staff to share information about managing addicted employers. Kitchen maids would exchange information about which food preparations might help counteract opium-induced nausea. Housekeepers would discuss strategies for preventing accidents when their mistresses were heavily sedated. And ladies' maids would share techniques for concealing the physical signs of addiction. These servant networks often understood the true extent of their employers' conditions far better than the addicted women themselves. Mary Patterson's notes include detailed observations about withdrawal symptoms, tolerance patterns, and the progression of addiction that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of pharmaceutical dependency. Yet the rigid class structures of Victorian society meant that servants could never directly address their employers' conditions or seek outside help without risking their positions and reputations. The children growing up in these households developed coping mechanisms that would shape their entire approach to family relationships and emotional expression. Young lady Catherine Pemberton's childhood letters reveal a girl who learned to read subtle signs indicating her mother's pharmaceutical state and adjust her own behavior accordingly. Catherine understood that certain times of day were better for requesting permissions, that particular facial expressions indicated when her mother was approachable, and that family crises required her to assume adult responsibilities when her primary caregiver was chemically incapacitated. Catherine's emotional development was profoundly affected by the unpredictability of her mother's availability and responsiveness. She learned to suppress her own needs and emotions to avoid creating additional stress that might worsen her mother's condition, developing patterns of self-denial and caretaking that would persist throughout her adult life. Her letters reveal a child who assumed responsibility for managing not just her own behavior, but also protecting her mother from situations that might trigger increased laudanum consumption. The impact on these children extended beyond immediate family dynamics to shape their understanding of medicine, authority, and social expectations. They grew up seeing pharmaceutical dependency as a normal part of adult life, particularly for women of their social class. Many developed their own complicated relationships with medication and authority figures, having learned early that adults in positions of responsibility might not be capable of consistent judgment or reliable protection. The seasonal rhythms of Victorian social life created predictable patterns of increased laudanum consumption that affected entire social networks. During the height of the London season, when social obligations reached their peak intensity, pharmaceutical suppliers reported dramatic increases in sales to society customers. Mrs. Helena Blackwood's consumption records show her laudanum use doubling during the months when she was expected to attend multiple social events each week, while managing complex household obligations and maintaining correspondence with dozens of relatives and acquaintances. The pressure to maintain perfect performance during these intensive social periods led many women to experiment with higher doses and more potent preparations. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's diary reveals her development of what she called event-specific dosing strategies. carefully calculated pharmaceutical regimens designed to provide optimal composure for different types of social obligations. She would consume larger doses before dinner parties, where she was expected to be particularly charming, moderate amounts for afternoon calling sessions, and carefully timed preparations for theatrical events where she needed to remain alert enough to follow complex performances. These sophisticated dosing strategies required considerable pharmaceutical knowledge and mathematical precision. Cordelia had to account for the timing of different social events, the duration of various obligations, her tolerance levels at different times of day, the interactions between laudanum and alcohol consumed at social gatherings, and even factors like seasonal changes in her metabolism. Her diary entries read like the notes of a dedicated scientist conducting complex experiments, except the subject of study was her own consciousness, and the goal was maintaining social performance rather than advancing medical knowledge. The precision required for this kind of pharmaceutical management reveals both the intelligence these women applied to their addiction and the exhausting complexity that their conditions introduced into daily life. What should have been natural social interactions became elaborate productions, requiring careful pharmaceutical choreography, turning every social obligation into a potential crisis if medication timing went wrong. The international pharmaceutical trade that supplied Britain's laudanum market was deeply connected to colonial exploitation and global opium trafficking, though society women consuming these products remained largely ignorant of these connections. The high-quality opium that went into premium laudanum preparations came primarily from British-controlled regions in India, where local populations were forced to cultivate poppies for export rather than food crops that might have prevented periodic famines. Mrs. Charlotte Fairfax's preference for what she called imperial preparations directly connected her addiction to the broader systems of colonial extraction that funded British wealth and power. The same economic structures that allowed her family to maintain their luxurious lifestyle also supplied the drugs that made that lifestyle psychologically bearable. Her consumption of Indian opium was part of a larger pattern of resource extraction that flowed from colonized populations to support the comfort and convenience of British society women. The irony of this connection was lost on virtually everyone involved. Women who served on charitable boards dedicated to helping the deserving poor were simultaneously consuming products that contributed to impoverishment and suffering in distant colonies. The same ladies who organized fundraising events for overseas missions were dependent on drugs produced through systems of economic coercion that undermined the very populations those missions claimed to serve. The global nature of the opium trade also meant that British society, women's addiction patterns influenced pharmaceutical markets across multiple continents. Increased demand from wealthy British consumers drove up prices for opium-based medications throughout Europe and North America, making these preparations less accessible to working-class populations who might have legitimate medical need for pain relief. The purchasing power of addicted society women essentially diverted pharmaceutical supplies away from medical uses toward recreational consumption. The technological innovations beginning to transform pharmaceutical manufacturing in the 1880s created new opportunities and challenges for women managing laudanum addiction. The development of standardized manufacturing processes made it possible to produce more consistent preparations, but also led to increased regulation and oversight that complicated procurement for heavy users. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell's correspondence with suppliers reveals growing anxiety about potential restrictions on pharmaceutical sales and increasing scrutiny from medical authorities. The introduction of new synthetic medications offered alternatives to traditional opium-based preparations, but many society women preferred laudanum due to its established social acceptability and their familiarity with its effects. Mrs. Beatrice Harrington experimented with newer preparations containing cocaine and other synthetic compounds, but found that these substances produced effects that were harder to conceal in social situations and carried greater risks of obvious intoxication. The evolving pharmaceutical landscape also created opportunities for suppliers to exploit their customers' loyalty and dependency. Established suppliers like Mr. James Harrison, began marketing their traditional laudanum preparations as superior to newer synthetic alternatives, emphasizing the natural origins and time-tested safety of opium-based medicines. This marketing strategy allowed them to maintain premium pricing while positioning their products as more refined and appropriate for discriminating society customers. The technological changes in pharmaceutical manufacturing coincided with the beginning of more systematic medical research into addiction and dependency. While this research remained focused primarily on male subjects and working-class populations, some of its findings began to filter into discussions among progressive physicians who treated society women. This created the first stirrings of medical awareness that the widespread laudanum consumption among upper-class women might represent a serious public health crisis rather than simply a fashionable medical trend. The emergence of women's rights movements in the 1880s created complex intersections with the hidden epidemic of laudanum addiction among society women. Activists like Frances Willard, who campaigned for women's suffrage and social reform, understood that many of their potential supporters were struggling with pharmaceutical dependency that undermined their ability to engage in political activism. However, addressing addiction directly would have required acknowledging problems that most society women preferred to keep hidden. The tension between political activism and pharmaceutical dependency created impossible choices for many upper-class women who might otherwise have supported reform movements. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's private letters reveal her awareness that her laudanum consumption made it impossible for her to take public positions on controversial issues, as any scrutiny of her personal life might expose her addiction and destroy her family's reputation. She remained privately sympathetic to women's suffrage, while publicly maintaining political neutrality to protect her pharmaceutical privacy. The women's reform movements of the period focused heavily on alcohol temperance, while largely silent about other remaining forms of substance dependency. This selective attention allowed society women to support temperance causes while continuing their own pharmaceutical consumption, creating a form of moral compartmentalization that protected their self-image while avoiding confrontation with their own addictive behaviors. The exclusion of pharmaceutical dependency from reform discourse meant that thousands of women who might have benefited from support and treatment, their conditions remained isolated with. The very social movements that claimed to advocate for women's well-being inadvertently contributed to the continued concealment of a crisis that was destroying the lives of many potential supporters and leaders. The psychological mechanisms that allowed these women to maintain their addiction while preserving their self-image reveal the sophisticated mental gymnastics required to navigate Victorian society's contradictory expectations. Mrs. Evangeline Crawford developed what she privately termed her philosophical framework for understanding her laudanum consumption, viewing it not as weakness, but as evidence of her refined sensibility and superior nervous organization. She genuinely believed that her need for pharmaceutical support demonstrated her elevated position in the hierarchy of feminine sensitivity. Evangeline's rationalization system was remarkably elaborate. She categorized different types of laudanum consumption based on their supposed purposes, distinguishing between what she called medicinal doses for physical ailments, therapeutic doses for nervous conditions, and preventive doses to maintain optimal functioning. This classification system allowed her to consume enormous quantities while maintaining the fiction that each dose served a specific medical purpose, rather than feeding an uncontrollable compulsion. The language these women developed to describe their addiction reveals how completely they had integrated pharmaceutical dependency into their understanding of proper feminine behavior. Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore wrote extensively in her private journals about what she termed constitutional management, describing her laudanum consumption as a sophisticated form of self-care that demonstrated her advanced understanding of her own delicate nature. She viewed women who didn't require pharmaceutical support as possessing coarser constitutions that lacked the refinement necessary for true sensitivity. This psychological framework created a complete inversion of normal addiction shame. Instead of viewing their dependency as evidence of weakness or moral failing, these women saw it as proof of their superior breeding and heightened awareness. Mrs. Arabella Thornfield wrote to her sister that she pitied women who could navigate life without pharmaceutical assistance, describing them as unfortunately insensitive to the subtle vibrations of existence that require delicate constitutional support. The religious dimensions of Victorian society created additional layers of complexity around laudanum addiction. Many devoutly religious women struggled to reconcile their pharmaceutical dependency with their faith, leading to elaborate theological justifications for continued consumption. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton developed what she called her doctrine of providential relief, arguing that God had provided opium as a special mercy for women of refined sensibility, who would otherwise be overwhelmed by the intensity of their spiritual and emotional experiences. Charlotte's theological framework transformed her addiction into a form of religious practice. She would begin each day with prayers of gratitude for the pharmaceutical relief that allowed her to fulfill her Christian duties, and she interpreted her need for laudanum as evidence of God's particular attention to her spiritual development. Her consumption became integrated with her daily devotions, with carefully timed doses that she believed enhanced her capacity for prayer and meditation. The intersection of addiction and religious belief created profound internal conflicts for many women. Mrs. Helena Blackwood experienced what she described as spiritual warfare between her desire to trust completely in divine providence and her psychological dependence on pharmaceutical intervention. Her diary entries reveal intense guilt about her inability to find peace through faith alone, combined with desperate rationalization about why her particular circumstances required chemical assistance. Helena's struggle illustrates how addiction complicated the religious frameworks that were supposed to provide meaning and structure for Victorian women's lives. She found herself caught between competing theological interpretations, sometimes viewing her laudanum use as lack of faith, and other times seeing it as acceptance of divine provision. This internal conflict added another layer of psychological stress to an already overwhelming situation, often driving her to increase consumption as a way of managing the anxiety created by her spiritual uncertainty. The seasonal patterns of religious observance created additional challenges for addicted women who needed to maintain perfect composure during high-visibility church events. Mrs. Victoria Fairchild's preparation for Easter services required elaborate pharmaceutical planning to ensure optimal presentation during the most important celebrations of the Christian year. She would begin increasing her laudanum consumption weeks before major holidays, building up reserves of calm that would allow her to participate fully in extended church services and social obligations. Victoria's religious calendar became entirely structured around her pharmaceutical needs. She would time her dosing to peak during Sunday morning services, adjust her consumption patterns to accommodate the longer church services of major holidays, and even plan her confession schedule around periods when she felt most capable of maintaining appropriate spiritual demeanor. Her faith became another performance, requiring chemical support rather than a source of genuine spiritual sustenance. The medical establishment's response to obvious cases of laudanum poisoning reveals the lengths to which Victorian society would go to protect the reputations of upper-class families. Dr. Marcus Whitfield treated several cases of near-fatal overdoses among society women, but his medical records consistently attributed these incidents to accidental medication errors or underlying health conditions rather than addiction-related consumption patterns. When Mrs. Isabella Blackthorne was found unconscious in her morning room with an empty laudanum bottle beside her chair, Dr. Whitfield's official report described the incident as accidental pharmaceutical miscalculation resulting from constitutional sensitivity to therapeutic preparations. His notes make no mention of the dozens of empty bottles found hidden throughout the house, or the testimony of servants who described their mistress consuming laudanum continuously throughout the day. This medical conspiracy threw out of silence extend the healthcare establishment serving upper-class families. Physicians understood that accurately diagnosing and documenting addiction among society women would destroy careers and reputations while providing no meaningful treatment options. The social consequences of honest medical assessment were so severe that doctors found it easier to maintain elaborate fictions rather than confront the reality of widespread pharmaceutical dependency among their most prominent patients. The collaboration between medical professionals and families to conceal addiction created a system where the most severely affected women received the least appropriate care. Mrs. Evangeline Crawford's condition deteriorated to the point where she was consuming nearly 12 ounces of laudanum daily, yet her physician continued prescribing even stronger preparations while documenting her case as successful treatment of chronic nervous exhaustion. The medical records create a completely false narrative of therapeutic success, while the real patient was slowly dying from systematic poisoning. The impact of laudanum addiction on Victorian women's intellectual and creative pursuits has been largely overlooked by historical accounts. Yet many prominent female writers, artists, and thinkers of the period struggled with pharmaceutical dependency. Mrs. Catherine Morrison combined her laudanum consumption with serious literary work, producing poetry and essays that were influenced by her altered states of consciousness. Her writing reveals both the creative inspiration and intellectual limitation that resulted from chronic opiate use. Catherine's poetry from her early period of laudanum use displays an ethereal quality that was praised by contemporary critics as evidence of feminine sensitivity and spiritual insight. Her verses about transcendent experiences and mystical union with nature were actually descriptions of drug-induced states, though neither she nor her readers understood this connection. The pharmaceutical enhancement of her creative work was interpreted as evidence of her natural artistic gifts rather than chemical alteration of consciousness. As Catherine's addiction progressed, her writing began to deteriorate in ways that mirror the cognitive decline associated with chronic opiate use. Her later poetry became increasingly repetitive and disconnected, with elaborate imagery that seemed profound but lacked coherent meaning. Her essays, once praised for their logical development and clear argumentation, became rambling meditations that lost focus and failed to reach meaningful conclusions. The decline in Catherine's intellectual capacity was gradual enough that her family and friends interpreted it as evidence of increasing spiritual refinement rather than cognitive impairment. Victorian culture's emphasis on feminine otherworldliness meant that her growing disconnection from practical reality was seen as appropriate evolution toward higher consciousness. Her addiction was literally destroying her mind, while her social circles celebrated what they perceived as her increasing ethereal wisdom. The artistic communities that flourished in certain areas of London became inadvertent gathering places for women struggling with laudanum addiction. Mrs. Beatrice Harrington's salon attracted writers, painters, and musicians who found inspiration in what they believed was the elevated atmosphere of refined conversation and aesthetic contemplation. In reality, many of the regular attendees were heavily medicated society women whose pharmaceutical consumption created an artificial sense of artistic transcendence. Beatrice's Thursday evening gatherings became legendary for the quality of conversation and the depth of artistic insight shared among participants. Guests would discuss literature, philosophy, and artistic technique with what seemed like unusual clarity and emotional intensity. The laudanum consumption that many attendees used to manage their social anxiety actually enhanced certain aspects of their aesthetic appreciation while undermining their critical judgment and practical reasoning abilities. The intersection of pharmaceutical dependency and artistic culture created a feedback loop where drug-induced experiences were mistaken for genuine creative inspiration. Women who might have developed authentic artistic talents instead became dependent on chemical enhancement that provided the illusion of heightened sensitivity while actually limiting their creative development. The Victorian equation of feminine artistic achievement with otherworldly sensitivity meant that addiction symptoms were often interpreted as evidence of exceptional creative gifts. The financial records of prominent art dealers and cultural institutions reveal the economic impact of laudanum addiction on Victorian artistic patronage. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton's purchase records show dramatic changes in her collecting patterns that correspond directly to the progression of her pharmaceutical dependency. During her early period of moderate laudanum use, she acquired thoughtful collections of contemporary paintings and rare books that demonstrated sophisticated aesthetic judgment. As Adelaide's addiction intensified, her purchasing decisions became increasingly impulsive and expensive. She would buy entire collections without careful examination, commission elaborate artistic projects that she would abandon before completion, and make enormous donations to cultural institutions during periods of heavy medication when her judgment was severely impaired. Her pharmaceutical consumption literally reshaped the Victorian art market through erratic patronage decisions that reflected chemical alteration rather than aesthetic preference. The servants working in households where laudanum addiction intersected with artistic and intellectual pursuits developed unique skills for managing their employer's creative work. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's secretary, Miss Margaret Thompson, learned to recognize which of her mistress's literary compositions were produced during periods of heavy medication and which reflected more sober judgment. Margaret would quietly edit or suppress work that might damage Eleanor's reputation while preserving pieces that maintained appropriate standards. Margaret's informal censorship protected Eleanor's literary reputation while concealing the extent to which laudanum had compromised her intellectual abilities. The published works that established Eleanor's fame as a thoughtful essayist and social commentator were actually heavily edited versions of rambling pharmaceutical-influenced writings. Margaret's intervention created a false historical record that attributed to Eleanor achievements that were actually collaborative efforts to manage addiction-related cognitive decline. The educational institutions that served upper-class women began to notice patterns of academic difficulty among students whose families struggled with pharmaceutical dependency. Miss Sarah Whitfield, head mistress of one of London's most prestigious finishing schools, observed that certain students displayed erratic academic performance that seemed to correlate with their family circumstances rather than their intellectual capabilities. Sarah's private notes describe students who would arrive at school displaying signs of emotional disturbance and cognitive confusion that gradually improved over the course of each term as they were removed from home environments where laudanum addiction was affecting family dynamics. These young women often struggled with concentration, memory problems, and emotional regulation that reflected the psychological impact of growing up with addicted caregivers. The boarding school environment provided these students with stability and structure that was often missing from their home lives, but it also created additional stress as they worried about returning to households where their mother's conditions continued to deteriorate. Sarah developed informal counseling approaches to help these students cope with family situations that she understood, but could never directly address due to social conventions that protected family privacy. The marriage negotiations that occupied much of Victorian social life became complicated by the hidden factor of laudanum addiction among potential brides and their families. Marriage settlements required careful financial planning that was often disrupted by the enormous costs associated with pharmaceutical dependency. Mrs. Charlotte Ashworth's family discovered during her daughter's engagement negotiations that Charlotte's laudanum expenses had consumed funds that were supposed to provide the girl's dowry. The Ashworth family found themselves in the impossible position of needing to explain missing dowry funds without revealing Charlotte's addiction, which would have destroyed both the current marriage negotiation and the family's broader social standing. They developed elaborate stories about investment losses and unexpected expenses that concealed the true financial drain while arranging alternative funding sources that would allow the marriage to proceed. These financial complications created ripple effects throughout the marriage market, as families struggling with addiction-related expenses found themselves unable to provide expected dowries or maintain appropriate social positions. Young women from affected families often found their marriage prospects limited not by their own qualities, but by their family's hidden pharmaceutical expenses that had undermined their economic viability as potential wives. The secrecy surrounding these financial problems meant that families continued to maintain expensive social appearances while struggling with debt and economic uncertainty. The costs of concealing addiction often exceeded the costs of the addiction itself, as families spent enormous amounts to maintain reputations that would be destroyed if their pharmaceutical dependencies became known. The domestic architecture of Victorian homes evolved to accommodate the needs of women managing laudanum addiction, though these changes were disguised as conventional feminine comfort improvements in and privacy. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell's renovation of her Mayfair townhouse included what she described as therapeutic spaces, designed to provide optimal environments for rest and recovery from the nervous exhaustion that supposedly required her pharmaceutical treatment. Victoria's architectural modifications created elaborate systems of private spaces where she could consume laudanum and experience its effects without observation from family members or servants. Her morning room was redesigned with multiple concealed storage areas for bottles. Her private sitting room included a specially designed reclining chair that provided optimal comfort during periods of heavy medication. And her bedroom featured a complex system of locks and hidden passages that allowed her to maintain her pharmaceutical routine without detection. These architectural adaptations reveal how completely addiction had reshaped the domestic environment of upper-class households. Rooms that appeared to visitors as examples of refined feminine taste were actually elaborate pharmaceutical laboratories designed to support and conceal chronic drug consumption. The Victorian emphasis on feminine domestic authority meant that women could make extensive changes to their homes without arousing suspicion, allowing them to create physical environments that enabled their addiction while maintaining social respectability. The servants working in these modified households understood the true purpose of architectural features that were described to visitors as evidence of refined aesthetic sensibility. They learned to navigate complex systems of concealment and privacy that allowed their mistresses to maintain pharmaceutical routines while preserving the appearance of normal domestic life. The transportation systems that connected Victorian society created additional opportunities and challenges for women managing laudanum addiction. The expansion of railway networks made it possible for addicted women to maintain relationships with suppliers across greater distances, but also created situations where pharmaceutical access might be interrupted by travel delays or mechanical failures. Mrs. Arabella Thornfield's travel preparations required elaborate backup systems to ensure continuous access to laudanum regardless of transportation difficulties. Arabella's carriage was modified to include concealed storage compartments that could hold several weeks' worth of pharmaceutical supplies, and she maintained emergency reserves at various locations along her regular travel routes. Her journey planning involved not just social and business considerations, but detailed pharmaceutical logistics that ensured her addiction could be maintained regardless of unexpected delays or route changes. The railway stations and coaching inns that served upper-class travellers became informal distribution points for laudanum supplies, as entrepreneurial pharmacists and suppliers recognized the opportunities created by wealthy women travelling between their various residences. These transportation hubs developed discrete networks of pharmaceutical commerce that allowed travelling addicts to maintain their consumption patterns without the complications of carrying large quantities of controlled substances. The anonymity provided by travel also created opportunities for experimentation with different preparations and dosages that might be too risky to attempt at home. Women could visit suppliers in distant cities, try new pharmaceutical combinations, and explore alternative consumption methods without the social constraints that limited their options in their home communities. The seasonal migration patterns of Victorian society created predictable demand cycles that sophisticated suppliers learned to anticipate and exploit. The annual movement of wealthy families between London, country estates, and fashionable resorts generated opportunities for pharmaceutical entrepreneurs to establish temporary operations that served the travelling addiction market, while avoiding the regulatory oversight that might affect permanent establishments. The cultural mythology surrounding laudanum consumption among society women created a romantic narrative that obscured the devastating reality of widespread addiction. Popular literature of the period portrayed pharmaceutical dependency as evidence of refined sensibility and artistic temperament, creating cultural models that made addiction seem not just acceptable, but actually desirable for women of superior breeding and intelligence. Mrs. Catherine Morrison's library contained dozens of novels and poems that celebrated the ethereal qualities of women who consumed laudanum for their nervous conditions. These literary works created a cultural framework that transformed addiction symptoms into romantic ideals, portraying the pallor, emotional detachment, and otherworldly demeanor associated with chronic opiate use as evidence of spiritual refinement and aesthetic sensitivity. The romanticization of pharmaceutical dependency meant that many women actively sought to achieve the appearance and behavior patterns associated with laudanum consumption, even when they weren't actually addicted to the substance. This cultural pressure created situations where addiction became a form of fashion statement, with women consuming drugs not just for their pharmacological effects, but as a way of signaling their membership in an elite community of sensitive and refined individuals. The literary celebration of laudanum-enhanced consciousness also provided addicted women with elaborate vocabularies for describing and justifying their pharmaceutical consumption. They could draw on romantic and aesthetic traditions that portrayed their drug use as evidence of superior sensitivity rather than medical pathology, creating psychological frameworks that supported continued addiction while protecting self-image and social standing. The intersection of pharmaceutical dependency and Victorian mourning customs created particularly complex situations where laudanum consumption was not just socially acceptable, but actively encouraged as appropriate response to loss and grief. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton's period of mourning following her husband's death provided perfect cover for escalating her laudanum consumption to levels that would have been scandalous under normal circumstances. Eleanor's mourning routine included elaborate pharmaceutical rituals that were interpreted by observers as evidence of appropriate feminine grief, rather than signs of dangerous addiction. She would consume laudanum before visiting her husband's grave, take additional doses before receiving condolence calls, and use the drug to maintain the composed demeanor expected of a grieving widow. Became integrate. Her pharmaceutical dependency with social expectations for mourning behavior in ways that made her addiction invisible to everyone around her. The extended duration of Victorian mourning periods meant that women could maintain heavy laudanum consumption for months or even years, while claiming therapeutic necessity for managing their grief. Eleanor's mourning lasted nearly 3 years, during which her pharmaceutical consumption reached levels that would have been fatal for someone without her developed tolerance. By the time her official mourning period ended, she was so severely addicted that she couldn't function without constant medication. The transition from mourning back to normal social life created additional challenges for women whose pharmaceutical dependency had escalated during periods of grief. Eleanor found herself unable to reduce her laudanum consumption, even after her mourning period ended. But she could no longer claim grief as justification for her continued pharmaceutical needs. She was forced to develop new medical explanations for consumption patterns that had become established during a period when such behavior was socially sanctioned and medically encouraged. The impact of laudanum addiction on Victorian women's relationships with their children reveals one of the most tragic dimensions of this hidden epidemic. Mrs. Charlotte Fairfax's maternal behavior was profoundly shaped by her pharmaceutical dependency, creating patterns of emotional availability and neglect that confused and damaged her children, while appearing to outside observers as examples of refined maternal sensitivity. Charlotte's morning routine with her children was entirely structured around her pharmaceutical schedule. She would spend time with them during periods when her laudanum levels provided optimal emotional warmth and patience, but would withdraw to her private rooms when the drug's effects made her irritable or unresponsive. Her children learned to read subtle signs indicating their mother's pharmaceutical state and adjusted their own behavior to avoid triggering negative reactions during vulnerable periods. The unpredictability of Charlotte's maternal availability created deep insecurity among her children, who never knew whether their mother would be emotionally present or distant during important moments in their lives. They developed coping strategies that included seeking comfort from servants, learning to suppress their own emotional needs, and assuming inappropriate responsibility for managing their mother's pharmaceutical requirements and protecting her from stressful situations that might worsen her condition. The long-term psychological impact on these children extended well beyond their immediate family relationships to shape their understanding of love, reliability, and emotional intimacy throughout their adult lives. Many grew up believing that love was inherently unpredictable and that their own needs were less important than protecting others from stress and difficulty. The pattern of pharmaceutical dependency also influenced their own relationships with medication and authority figures, as they had learned early that adults in positions of responsibility might not be capable of consistent judgment or reliable protection. The generational transmission of addiction patterns within Victorian families created cycles of dependency that persisted across multiple generations, though the mechanisms of this transmission remained largely invisible to the families themselves. Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood's daughter, Catherine, began displaying signs of what the family physician termed constitutional sensitivity at age 16, requiring pharmaceutical support that mirrored her mother's consumption patterns, despite having no conscious knowledge of her mother's addiction. Catherine's introduction to laudanum came through what appeared to be legitimate medical treatment for the severe headaches she developed during her debut season. Her symptoms were remarkably similar to those her mother had experienced decades earlier, suggesting either genetic predisposition or learned behavioral patterns that created psychological conditions requiring pharmaceutical intervention. The family physician, Dr. Marcus Fieldstone, prescribed the same graduated laudanum regimen he had used successfully with Catherine's mother, viewing the similarity in their conditions as evidence of inherited feminine delicacy, rather than recognizing the environmental factors that might have contributed to both women's pharmaceutical needs. The household routines that Catherine grew up observing had normalized pharmaceutical dependency as part of proper feminine self-care. She had learned from infancy that ladies of breeding required special medical attention, that morning and afternoon medications were normal parts of daily routine, and that maintaining composed demeanor during stressful situations often required chemical assistance. These lessons were never explicitly taught, but were absorbed through years of observation and unconscious imitation. Catherine's progression into serious addiction followed an accelerated timeline that reflected both her genetic vulnerability and her sophisticated understanding of pharmaceutical management techniques learned through childhood observation. Within 6 months of beginning treatment, she was consuming quantities that had taken her mother years to achieve, demonstrating an intuitive grasp of dosing strategies and procurement methods that could only have been acquired through prolonged exposure to addiction management systems. The family's financial records reveal how addiction expenses compounded across generations, creating economic pressures that affected entire extended family networks. By 1883, the combined pharmaceutical costs for both Evangeline and Catherine Blackwood exceeded the household's annual income from all other sources, forcing the family to mortgage properties and liquidate investments to maintain their dual addictions while preserving their social position. The servants working in multi-generational addiction households developed specialized skills that were passed down through their own family networks. Mary Patterson trained her daughter Elizabeth in the complex techniques required to manage addicted employers, creating informal educational systems that transmitted knowledge about pharmaceutical dependency management across generations of domestic workers. These servant families often understood addiction patterns better than the medical professionals treating their employers, yet their knowledge remained confined to informal networks that had no influence on official medical practice or social policy. Elizabeth Patterson's detailed notes about managing both mother and daughter addiction reveal the exponential complexity that multi-generational dependency created within household systems. She had to coordinate pharmaceutical schedules for 2 people whose tolerance levels and consumption patterns were constantly changing. Manage procurement from multiple suppliers to avoid arousing suspicion about the household's massive consumption levels, and maintain elaborate deception systems that concealed the extent of both women's conditions from male family members and social visitors. The psychological dynamics within families, affected by multi-generational addiction, created patterns of codependency, an enabling that extended far beyond the immediate addiction issues. Catherine Blackwood's younger brother William grew up assuming responsibility for protecting both his mother and sister from situations that might trigger increased pharmaceutical consumption, developing caretaking behaviors that prevented him from forming normal peer relationships or pursuing age-appropriate activities and interests. William's childhood letters reveal a boy who had learned to suppress his own emotional needs and developmental requirements to serve as an emotional regulator for the addicted women in his household. He would monitor social situations for potential stressors, intervene in family conflicts before they escalated to levels that might worsen his mother's and sister's conditions, and even manipulate his own academic and social schedules to ensure his presence during periods when the women's pharmaceutical consumption might create household crises. The educational institutions serving upper-class families began recognizing patterns among students from households affected by multi-generational addiction, though they lacked vocabulary to describe or address these issues directly. Teachers noticed that certain students displayed premature maturity combined with anxiety about family situations, exceptional sensitivity to adult emotional states, and difficulty forming trusting relationships with authority figures who might prove unreliable or inconsistent. Young Catherine Blackwood's academic performance fluctuated dramatically based on her family's pharmaceutical situation at home, creating patterns of excellence followed by sudden decline that puzzled her instructors. During periods when her mother's addiction was relatively stable, Catherine would produce exceptional work that demonstrated remarkable intellectual capacity and creative insight. However, when family pharmaceutical crises required her emotional attention and caretaking energy, her academic performance would deteriorate rapidly as her psychological resources were diverted to managing addiction-related family dynamics. The social networks surrounding multi-generational addiction families created complex webs of mutual enabling and protection that extended far beyond individual households. When the Blackwood family's financial resources became strained by their dual pharmaceutical expenses, other society families quietly provided assistance through elaborate systems of loans, gifts, and shared resources that maintained the family's social position while enabling continued addiction without requiring acknowledgement of the underlying problems. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton's correspondence reveals how established society families would coordinate support for newer addiction cases, providing mentorship in procurement strategies, sharing supplier networks, and offering emotional support that normalized pharmaceutical dependency as a manageable aspect of refined feminine life. These support systems created communities of mutual dependency, where individual recovery became virtually impossible because it would require abandoning entire social networks that had developed around shared addiction management. The marriage market became increasingly complicated by the prevalence of multi-generational addiction within prominent families. Marriage negotiations required careful investigation of pharmaceutical expenses and addiction histories that could never be discussed directly, leading to elaborate systems of coded inquiry and discrete information sharing among families considering marriage alliances. The presence of addiction within a family line became a significant factor in marriage planning, though it was never acknowledged explicitly in formal negotiations. Charles Whitmore's courtship of Catherine Blackwood required his family to conduct subtle investigations into the Blackwood household's pharmaceutical situation without appearing to question the family's respectability or Catherine's suitability as a potential wife. The Whitmore family's private correspondence reveals their awareness that marriage into an addiction-affected family would require ongoing financial and social support for pharmaceutical dependency, though they never used direct language to describe these concerns. The wedding preparations for addiction-affected families created additional layers of complexity as pharmaceutical consumption needed to be carefully managed to ensure appropriate presentation during high-visibility social events. Catherine Blackwood's wedding required elaborate coordination between her pharmaceutical schedule and the timing of various ceremonial obligations, with backup plans for managing potential withdrawal symptoms or medication-related complications during the extended celebration period. Catherine's wedding dress was modified to include discreet pockets and hidden compartments that would allow her to maintain access to laudanum throughout the lengthy ceremony and reception activities. Her lady's maid developed detailed timelines that coordinated pharmaceutical consumption with social obligations, ensuring optimal presentation during photography sessions, receiving line activities, and dancing portions of the celebration, while avoiding obvious intoxication that might cause scandal. The honeymoon period created unique challenges for newly married women managing laudanum addiction, as they needed to conceal their pharmaceutical dependency from their husbands, while adjusting to new domestic arrangements that might disrupt established consumption routines. Catherine's honeymoon correspondence with her mother reveals elaborate systems for maintaining pharmaceutical supplies while traveling, including arrangements with suppliers in various European cities and techniques for concealing consumption from her new husband during intimate domestic situations. The transition from maiden to wife required Catherine to establish new procurement networks and concealment systems that would function within her married household while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect her reputation and marriage. She had to train new servants in pharmaceutical management techniques, establish relationships with suppliers near her new residence, and develop storage and consumption routines that would function within the different architectural and social constraints of her married life. The religious communities serving upper-class society struggled to address the moral and spiritual dimensions of pharmaceutical dependency without acknowledging the extent of the problem within their own congregations. Reverend Dr. Samuel Richardson ministered to several families affected by multi-generational addiction, but his theological framework provided no useful guidance for addressing conditions that were simultaneously medical, moral, and social in their dimensions and implications. Dr. Richardson's sermons occasionally touched on themes of spiritual dependency and worldly attachments that resonated deeply with his addicted parishioners, though he remained unaware of the specific applications his congregation found in his general theological teachings. Women like Evangeline and Catherine Blackwood would find profound meaning in discussions of surrender to divine will and acceptance of suffering, interpreting these spiritual concepts through the lens of their pharmaceutical dependency, while never making explicit connections between religious teachings and their personal situations. The communion services that form the centre of Anglican worship created particular challenges for heavily medicated parishioners who needed to maintain appropriate spiritual demeanour while managing the interactions between laudanum and sacramental wine. Many women developed elaborate timing systems that coordinated their pharmaceutical consumption with church attendance, ensuring optimal spiritual presentation while avoiding dangerous drug interactions or obvious intoxication during sacred ceremonies. The seasonal cycles of church calendar events required careful pharmaceutical planning for families managing multiple addictions, as major religious holidays involved extended services, social obligations, and family gatherings that demanded sustained performance over several days. Easter and Christmas preparations in addiction-affected households became elaborate logistical operations that coordinated pharmaceutical schedules with religious observances, family visits, and social entertainment requirements. The artistic and intellectual salons that flourished in certain areas of Victorian society became gathering places where pharmaceutical dependency could be disguised as aesthetic sensitivity and creative inspiration. Mrs. Beatrice Harrington's weekly literary gatherings attracted women whose laudanum consumption enhanced their appreciation for poetry and philosophical discussion, while undermining their critical judgment and practical reasoning abilities, creating an atmosphere of apparent intellectual sophistication that was actually chemically induced. The conversations at these salons often reached extraordinary levels of apparent insight and emotional depth, as participants' pharmaceutical consumption lowered social inhibitions and enhanced emotional responsiveness to artistic and intellectual stimuli. Women would discuss literature, philosophy, and aesthetic theory with unusual passion and apparent understanding, creating reputations for intellectual brilliance that were actually based on drug-enhanced social performance rather than genuine scholarly achievement. Beatrice's salon became famous throughout London society for the quality of discussion and the depth of artistic appreciation displayed by regular participants. Literary figures would specifically request invitations to her Thursday exposure to what they believed was an unusually sophisticated and sensitive audience. The pharmaceutical enhancement that many attendees used to manage their social anxiety actually improved certain aspects of their aesthetic responses, while compromising their ability to engage in sustained critical analysis or logical argumentation. The artistic patronage decisions made by salon participants often reflected their chemically altered judgment rather than genuine aesthetic preference, leading to distortions in the Victorian art market that favoured work appealing to drug-enhanced sensibilities over pieces requiring sober critical evaluation. Painters and writers learned to create work specifically designed to appeal to audiences they knew would be viewing or reading their creations while under pharmaceutical influence, developing artistic styles that emphasized emotional impact over intellectual substance. The publishing industry that serves society, women became inadvertently complicit in supporting addiction by producing literature that romanticized pharmaceutical dependency and provided cultural validation for drug consumption, presented as evidence of refined sensibility. Popular novels and poetry collections celebrated the ethereal qualities associated with laudanum use, creating cultural models that made addiction seem not just acceptable, but actually desirable for women of superior breeding and artistic temperament. Mrs. Catherine Morrison's personal library contained extensive collections of literature that portrayed pharmaceutical dependency as evidence of spiritual refinement and aesthetic sensitivity, providing her with elaborate cultural frameworks for understanding her addiction as evidence of superior consciousness rather than medical pathology. These books created vocabularies that allowed her to describe her drug consumption in romantic and artistic terms, rather than clinical language that might have encouraged her to seek medical treatment. The subscription lending libraries that served upper-class women carefully curated their collections to include works that supported prevailing attitudes about feminine sensitivity and pharmaceutical treatment, while excluding literature that might present addiction as a medical condition requiring intervention rather than a romantic ideal worthy of cultivation. This literary censorship created information environments that supported continued addiction by providing cultural validation while limiting access to alternative perspectives that might have encouraged recovery. The international correspondence networks that connected Victorian society women across national boundaries created opportunities for pharmaceutical knowledge exchange that transcended local regulatory and social constraints. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton's letters with relatives living in various parts of the British Empire reveal sophisticated information sharing about different regional approaches to opium-based medication, creating informal networks that facilitated access to more potent preparations than were available through local suppliers. These international correspondence networks operated as unofficial pharmaceutical research communities, where women would share detailed information about dosing strategies, preparation techniques, and supplier reliability across multiple countries and cultures. Adelaide's correspondence includes elaborate discussions of the relative merits of Indian opium preparations versus Chinese alternatives, Turkish medical approaches compared to British pharmaceutical standards, and American innovations in opiate-based medication that might offer advantages over traditional European preparations. The global nature of these pharmaceutical information networks meant that addiction among British society women was influenced by and contributed to similar patterns in other countries, creating international communities of mutual enabling and support. that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. Women would maintain elaborate correspondence with fellow addicts across multiple continents, sharing procurement strategies, offering emotional support, and exchanging information about medical and social approaches to managing pharmaceutical dependency. The colonial connections that provided access to raw opium also created opportunities for British society women to develop relationships with international suppliers who could provide more potent preparations than were available through legitimate pharmaceutical channels. Mrs. Charlotte Fairfax's correspondence with trading company representatives in India reveals elaborate arrangements for obtaining high-grade opium that was ostensibly purchased for legitimate medical purposes, but was actually destined for personal consumption that far exceeded any reasonable therapeutic requirements. These colonial pharmaceutical networks operated through the same commercial and social connections that facilitated other forms of international trade, making them virtually impossible for authorities to detect or interrupt. Women who had never engaged in any form of illegal activity found themselves operating sophisticated international drug trafficking operations that moved enormous quantities of narcotics across national boundaries, all disguised as legitimate commercial and family correspondence. The technological innovations that began transforming pharmaceutical manufacturing in the 1880s created new opportunities and challenges for women managing established addiction patterns. The development of standardized manufacturing processes made it possible to produce more consistent preparations, but also led to increased regulation and oversight that complicated procurement for heavy users who had become accustomed to unlimited access through informal networks and personal relationships with individual suppliers. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell's correspondence with various suppliers reveals growing anxiety about potential restrictions on pharmaceutical sales and increasing scrutiny from medical authorities who were beginning to recognize addiction as a serious medical condition rather than simply a fashionable lifestyle choice. The increasing medicalization of addiction created new forms of stigma that made it more difficult for society women to maintain their pharmaceutical consumption while preserving their social respectability. The introduction of new synthetic medications offered alternatives to traditional opium-based preparations, but many established addicts preferred laudanum due to its social acceptability and their familiarity with its effects. Experimental consumption of newer preparations containing cocaine and other synthetic compounds often produced effects that were more difficult to conceal in social situations and carried greater risks of obvious intoxication that might expose the user's pharmaceutical dependency to unwanted scrutiny. The evolving pharmaceutical landscape also created opportunities for established suppliers to exploit their customers' loyalty and dependency by marketing traditional laudanum preparations as superior to newer synthetic alternatives. Suppliers would emphasize the natural origins and time-tested safety of opium-based medicines, while raising prices to reflect the supposed superior quality and social appropriateness of their traditional products compared to newer pharmaceutical innovations. The emergence of medical research into addiction and dependency began to filter into discussions among progressive physicians who treated society women, creating the first stirrings of professional awareness that widespread laudanum consumption among upper-class women might represent a serious public health crisis, rather than simply evidence of refined feminine sensitivity requiring ongoing pharmaceutical support. However, this evolving medical understanding had little immediate impact on treatment practices, as social pressures to protect family reputations continued to outweigh medical considerations in determining appropriate responses to obvious cases of pharmaceutical dependency. The intersection of evolving medical knowledge and established social practices created impossible situations for physicians who recognized addiction among their society patients, but lacked effective treatment options or social support for intervention approaches that might threaten family reputations and professional relationships. Medical professionals found themselves caught between their growing understanding of addiction as a serious medical condition and their professional obligations to protect patient confidentiality and family social standing. The children and grandchildren of addiction-affected families often carried the psychological and social consequences of their family's pharmaceutical dependency well into the 20th century, creating lasting impacts that extended far beyond the immediate Victorian period. The patterns of emotional regulation, relationship dynamics, and approaches to stress management learned in addiction-affected households influence multiple generations of family members who never understood the origins of their learned behaviours or their family's distinctive approaches to managing emotional and social challenges. Young William Blackwood's adult relationships reflected the caretaking patterns and emotional regulation strategies he had learned during childhood in a household affected by multi-generational addiction. His marriage was characterized by his assumption of excessive responsibility for his wife's emotional well-being, his hypervigilance about potential sources of stress or conflict, and his difficulty accepting care or support from others who might prove unreliable or inconsistent in their availability and responsiveness. The social networks and cultural institutions that had developed around supporting and concealing Victorian women's laudanum addiction gradually adapted to address other forms of pharmaceutical dependency as medical knowledge advanced and new substances became available. The informal support systems, procurement networks, and concealment strategies that had been perfected for managing opium-based addiction provided templates for addressing subsequent generations of women struggling with different forms of substance dependency that required similar approaches to social protection and family reputation management. The elaborate systems of mutual support, information sharing, and social protection that Victorian society women had created around laudanum addiction established patterns of community response to pharmaceutical dependency that persisted well beyond the specific historical circumstances that had originally created them. These social innovations provided models for addressing substance dependency while maintaining social respectability that influenced approaches to addiction treatment and family support for decades beyond the Victorian period. The transformation of Victorian domestic architecture to accommodate pharmaceutical dependency extended beyond individual households to influence entire neighbourhood developments and urban planning decisions. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's influence on the design of her family's new Belgravia mansion created architectural innovations that would be copied throughout fashionable London districts. Her architect, Mr. James Morrison, unknowingly pioneered what became standard features in upper-class homes designed to support women's pharmaceutical needs while maintaining social respectability. Cordelia's specifications included elaborate systems of private corridors connecting various rooms, allowing movement throughout the house without observation from family members or visitors. Her morning room featured specially designed alcoves that appeared decorative but actually provided concealed storage for pharmaceutical supplies. The servants' quarters were positioned to minimize observation of the family's private areas while ensuring staff could respond quickly to emergencies without compromising their mistress's privacy during vulnerable periods. The architectural innovations that Cordelia pioneered spread throughout fashionable society as other families recognized the practical advantages of homes designed around feminine privacy and medical needs. Builders began incorporating similar features into new construction projects, creating what became known as therapeutic domestic environments that supported women's health requirements while maintaining appropriate social appearances. These modifications became so common that they were eventually considered standard elements of refined residential design, rather than accommodations for specific medical conditions. The influence of pharmaceutical dependency on domestic architecture created a parallel economy of specialized craftsmen and suppliers who understood the unique requirements of addiction-affected households. Furniture makers developed pieces with concealed compartments and hidden storage areas. Locksmiths created security systems that protected pharmaceutical supplies while appearing to serve conventional purposes. And interior decorators learned to design spaces that accommodated the unpredictable needs of heavily medicated residents while maintaining aesthetic standards appropriate for social entertaining. Mrs. Helena Blackwood's relationship with her interior decorator, Mr. Charles Pemberton, evolved into a sophisticated collaboration that addressed her pharmaceutical requirements without explicit acknowledgement of their true purpose. Charles learned to recognize the subtle requirements that guided Helena's decorating decisions, understanding that her preferences for certain types of seating, lighting arrangements, and room layouts reflected her need to manage consumption and recovery periods rather than simple aesthetic preferences. Charles developed expertise in creating environments that supported pharmaceutical consumption while maintaining social respectability, becoming known throughout London society for his ability to design interiors that promoted feminine health and well-being. His reputation attracted clients from families struggling with similar issues, though the nature of his specialized knowledge was never discussed explicitly. His success created a model that other decorators would emulate, spreading architectural accommodations for addiction throughout upper-class society without ever acknowledging their true purpose. The seasonal cycles of Victorian social life created predictable patterns in domestic space usage that reflected pharmaceutical consumption rhythms rather than conventional social customs. Mrs. Evangeline Crawford's household schedules revolved around her morning and afternoon medication periods, with family activities, servant duties, and social obligations carefully timed to accommodate her pharmaceutical needs while maintaining the appearance of normal domestic routine. Evangeline's breakfast room became her primary pharmaceutical consumption space during morning hours, with family members and servants understanding that this area was reserved for her exclusive use between 8 and 10 each morning. Her private sitting room served similar functions during afternoon hours, with elaborate protocols ensuring her privacy during periods when medication effects might make social interaction challenging or inappropriate. These spatial arrangements became so thoroughly integrated into household routine that family members followed them automatically without conscious awareness of their connection to pharmaceutical dependency. The servants working in these carefully orchestrated households developed sophisticated understanding of spatial management techniques that supported their mistress's addiction while maintaining appropriate domestic appearances. They learned to read environmental cues that indicated their employer's pharmaceutical state, understanding which rooms could be safely entered for cleaning or other duties, and which spaces required careful approach or complete avoidance during certain periods. Mary Fletcher's training of younger servants included detailed instruction in spatial awareness and environmental management that protected their mistress's pharmaceutical privacy while ensuring efficient household operation. Mary taught new staff to recognize subtle signs indicating when various rooms were available for normal use versus when they required special handling due to their mistress's medical needs. These training systems created informal educational networks that transmitted knowledge about addiction accommodation across multiple households and generations of domestic workers. The garden spaces surrounding upper-class Victorian homes became additional areas requiring pharmaceutical accommodation, as many addicted women found outdoor environments particularly conducive to certain aspects of their consumption routines. Mrs. Charlotte Pemberton's garden redesign included secluded areas designed for private rest and recovery, with architectural features that provided shelter and privacy while maintaining aesthetic appeal appropriate for a fashionable residence. Charlotte's garden pavilion became her preferred location for afternoon pharmaceutical consumption during favourable weather, offering isolation from household observation while providing comfortable surroundings for managing medication effects. The pavilion's design incorporated features that supported various pharmaceutical needs, including comfortable seating arrangements, protection from weather and wind, and discrete storage areas for supplies and accessories required for optimal consumption management. The landscaping surrounding these pharmaceutical retreat spaces required careful planning to balance privacy needs with social expectations for fashionable garden design. Charlotte worked with her gardener, Mr. William Thompson, to create plantings that provided natural screening while maintaining the ornamental appearance expected in upper-class residential gardens. The resulting landscape innovations influenced garden design throughout fashionable society, as other families recognized the practical and aesthetic advantages of incorporating similar private retreat spaces into their own residential properties. The transportation infrastructure that served upper-class society adapted to accommodate the pharmaceutical needs of traveling addicts, creating informal networks of support and supply that extended across national boundaries. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton's annual continental tours required elaborate logistical planning that coordinated pharmaceutical supplies with travel schedules, accommodation arrangements, and social obligations in multiple countries and cultural contexts. Adelaide's travelling carriage was modified to include concealed storage compartments that could hold pharmaceutical supplies for extended journeys, while her luggage incorporated hidden areas that protected essential medications from customs inspection or accidental discovery by travelling companions. Her lady's maid, Sarah Morrison, developed expertise in international pharmaceutical logistics that made her invaluable not just to Adelaide, but to other society women planning similar continental travels. Sarah's knowledge of European pharmaceutical markets, supplier networks, and customs regulations created opportunities for her to provide consulting services to other addiction-affected families planning international travel. Her informal business operated through servant networks and family connections, offering guidance on procurement strategies, legal requirements, and cultural considerations that affected pharmaceutical access in different countries and regions. The continental hotel industry that served British society travellers began recognising patterns among certain guests, whose accommodation requirements seemed unusually specific and whose behaviour suggested medical conditions requiring special consideration. Hotel managers in fashionable resort areas developed discreet services that addressed these guests' pharmaceutical needs without explicit acknowledgement of their true nature, creating hospitality innovations that supported addiction while maintaining social respectability. Mrs. Victoria Fairchild's regular visits to Baden-Baden established relationships with hotel staff who understood her requirements for privacy, medical accommodation, and access to local pharmaceutical supplies without requiring detailed explanations of her specific medical conditions. The hotel's concierge services evolved to include discreet pharmaceutical consulting and procurement assistance that served not just Victoria, but other British guests with similar needs. The international spa communities that attracted wealthy British women created informal pharmaceutical markets that operated alongside conventional medical treatments and social activities. These resort environments provided perfect cover for heavy drug consumption, as the medical justification for various treatments was built into the spa experience itself, allowing addicted women to consume enormous quantities of different preparations while maintaining the fiction that they were following legitimate therapeutic regimens. The social clubs and private societies that served upper-class women developed elaborate protocols for accommodating members whose pharmaceutical dependency affected their ability to participate in conventional social activities. Mrs. Beatrice Harrington's Literary Club modified its meeting schedules and activity planning to ensure that addicted members could participate fully without exposing their conditions to unwanted scrutiny or social embarrassment. Beatrice's club developed what they termed flexible participation protocols that allowed members to attend social events according to their individual health requirements and medical schedules. These accommodations were presented as evidence of the club's sophisticated understanding of feminine health and medical needs, rather than acknowledgement of specific addiction issues, creating social environments that normalized pharmaceutical dependency while protecting member privacy and respectability. The club's meeting rooms were designed with multiple seating areas that provided different levels of privacy and social engagement, allowing members to participate in group activities while managing their pharmaceutical needs according to their individual tolerance levels and consumption schedules. These spatial innovations created social environments that supported addiction while maintaining the appearance of normal feminine social interaction. The charitable organizations that occupied much of society women's time developed informal systems for accommodating board members and volunteers whose pharmaceutical dependency affected their reliability and judgment capacity. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's charitable foundation adapted its governance structures to ensure continuity of operations, despite the unpredictable availability of key personnel who struggled with addiction-related health issues. Eleanor's foundation developed rotating leadership systems that distributed responsibilities among multiple board members, ensuring that important decisions and operational requirements could effectively, even when individual be-managed leaders were temporarily unavailable due to medical conditions or treatment requirements. These organizational innovations spread throughout the charitable sector as other institutions recognized the practical advantages of management structures that accommodated members' health fluctuations. The charitable work itself became a form of therapy for some addicted women, providing structured activities and social purpose that helped them maintain psychological stability while managing their pharmaceutical dependency. Mrs. Helena Blackwood found that her work organizing aid for impoverished families provided emotional satisfaction and social validation that reduced some of her psychological need for pharmaceutical enhancement, though she never made explicit connections between her charitable activities and her medication requirements. Helena's charitable work also created opportunities for her to develop relationships with working-class women, whose own struggles with poverty and hardship provided perspective on her privileged but complicated life circumstances. These cross-class interactions offered emotional experiences and social insights that her usual upper-class social circle could not provide. Though the class barriers of Victorian society prevented these relationships from developing into genuine friendships that might have provided meaningful support for her addiction struggles, the religious communities that served upper-class society struggled to provide meaningful spiritual guidance for women whose pharmaceutical dependency created complex moral and theological dilemmas. Reverend Dr. Marcus Whitfield counseled several parishioners who privately sought guidance about their relationship with laudanum. Though his theological training provided limited practical wisdom for addressing conditions that combined medical, moral, and spiritual dimensions in unprecedented ways, Dr. Whitfield's pastoral approach emphasized prayer, scripture study, and spiritual discipline as responses to all forms of suffering and temptation. But these conventional religious remedies proved inadequate for addressing the complex psychological and physical aspects of pharmaceutical dependency. His well-meaning advice often increased rather than decreased the guilt and spiritual confusion experienced by addicted parishioners who found themselves unable to achieve spiritual victory over their pharmaceutical needs through conventional religious practices. Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth's correspondence with Dr. Whitfield reveals her desperate attempts to understand her laudanum consumption within Christian frameworks that emphasize divine providence, personal responsibility, and spiritual growth. Her letters describe elaborate theological justifications for continued pharmaceutical use alongside genuine spiritual seeking that reflected her desire to maintain both her drug consumption and her religious identity without acknowledging their fundamental incompatibility. Dr. Whitfield's responses to Cordelia demonstrate the limitations of Victorian religious thinking when confronted with addiction issues that transcended simple moral categories. His advice emphasized spiritual disciplines and moral improvement that assumed her pharmaceutical consumption reflected weakness of will rather than medical dependency, creating guidance that increased her shame and self-condemnation while providing no practical assistance for addressing her actual condition. The seasonal rhythms of religious observance created additional challenges for addicted women who needed to maintain appropriate spiritual demeanor during high-visibility church events while managing pharmaceutical consumption that affected their emotional stability and social presentation. Mrs. Charlotte Fairfax's preparation for major religious holidays required elaborate coordination between her spiritual obligations and her pharmaceutical needs, creating complex scheduling challenges that reflected the fundamental tensions between her addiction and her faith. Charlotte's Christmas and Easter preparations became elaborate pharmaceutical planning exercises that coordinated her medication schedule with extended church services, family gatherings, and social obligations that demanded sustained spiritual and social performance over multiple days. Her ability to participate meaningfully in religious observances became entirely dependent on carefully managed pharmaceutical consumption that provided emotional stability while avoiding obvious intoxication during sacred ceremonies. The music and artistic programs that enriched Victorian religious life provided particular challenges for addicted women whose pharmaceutical consumption affected their ability to participate in choir performances, musical presentations, and other cultural activities that required sustained attention and coordinated group participation. Mrs. Victoria Caldwell's involvement in herd careful management of her Low Church's musical programs required arnhem consumption to ensure optimal vocal performance, while avoiding medication effects that might compromise her ability to maintain proper timing and pitch during group musical presentations. Victoria's pharmaceutical scheduling around musical performances became increasingly complex as her tolerance grew and her consumption requirements increased, creating situations where her religious and artistic commitments conflicted with her addiction management needs. She eventually withdrew from musical activities that required sustained participation, claiming health issues that prevented reliable attendance at rehearsals and performances, while actually protecting herself from situations where her pharmaceutical dependency might become obvious to fellow participants. The international missionary activities that attracted support from upper-class women created opportunities for addicted donors to channel their guilt and spiritual seeking into charitable work that addressed global suffering while avoiding confrontation with their own dependency issues. Mrs. Arabella Thornton's generous support for overseas missions reflected her genuine desire to serve God and help others, but also provided psychological relief from the moral conflicts created by her pharmaceutical consumption. Arabella's missionary correspondence allowed her to develop relationships with religious workers in distant countries, whose dedication and sacrifice provided spiritual inspiration that temporarily satisfied her desire for meaningful Christian service. These international religious connections offered emotional experiences and spiritual insights that her drug-compromised local religious participation could not provide, though the geographic distance prevented these relationships from developing into personal accountability that might have challenged her addiction. The missionary societies that received support from addiction-affected donors developed informal understanding of their benefactors' complex motivations and inconsistent giving patterns, recognizing that some of their most generous supporters struggled with personal issues that affected their ability to maintain steady financial and emotional commitment to overseas work. These organizations learned to structure their fundraising and communication strategies around the psychological and spiritual needs of donors whose personal circumstances required special sensitivity and accommodation. The prison reform and social welfare movements that attracted upper-class women's attention created ironic situations where addicted society women worked to address social problems that included substance dependency among working-class populations. Mrs. Helena Blackwood's involvement in prison reform brought her into contact with women whose alcohol and drug problems had contributed to their criminal behavior, creating encounters that might have provided insight into her own condition if class barriers had not prevented meaningful connection and self-recognition. Helena's charitable work with imprisoned women allowed her to maintain her sense of moral superiority and social responsibility, while avoiding recognition of the similarities between her own compulsive drug consumption and the addiction issues that had contributed to her clients' legal troubles. The class-based assumptions that guided her charitable approach prevented her from recognizing that her privileged pharmaceutical consumption and the class substance working abuse she sought to address represented different manifestations of similar underlying psychological and social problems. The reform movements themselves provided structured activities and social purpose that helped some addicted women maintain psychological stability while managing their pharmaceutical dependency, though the irony of their situation remained largely invisible to participants and observers alike. The social validation and sense of purpose that came from reform work offered partial alternatives to the psychological benefits that these women derived from pharmaceutical consumption, though few made explicit connections between their charitable activities and their personal medication needs. The educational institutions that served upper-class families developed informal protocols for managing students whose family circumstances included pharmaceutical dependency among parents or siblings. Teachers and administrators learned to recognize behavioral patterns that suggested addiction-related family problems, developing supportive approaches that helped these students cope with unstable home environments while maintaining appropriate academic and social expectations. Miss Sarah Whitfield's boarding school created what she termed pastoral care programs that provided additional emotional support for students whose family circumstances required special sensitivity and understanding. These programs offered structured activities, counseling relationships, and peer support that helped students develop coping skills for managing family stress while maintaining their academic and social development within the school community. Sarah's approach emphasized building resilience and independence among students whose home environments might not provide consistent emotional support or reliable guidance, preparing them for adult responsibilities while acknowledging the unique challenges they faced due to their family circumstances. Her educational philosophy influenced other institutions serving similar populations, creating pedagogical approaches that address the complex needs of children from addiction-affected families without explicitly acknowledging the nature of their family problems. The marriage preparation and courtship customs that governed upper-class romantic relationships required careful navigation of pharmaceutical dependency issues that could never be discussed directly but significantly affected family compatibility and financial planning. Marriage negotiations involved subtle investigations into pharmaceutical expenses and addiction patterns that might affect long-term family stability and social standing, creating complex social dynamics around romantic relationships and family alliance formation. Charles Whitmore's courtship of Catherine Blackwood required his family to conduct discreet inquiries into the Blackwood household's pharmaceutical situation while maintaining appropriate social protocols around courtship and marriage negotiation. The Whitmore family's private discussions reveal their understanding that marriage into an addiction-affected family would require ongoing financial and social accommodation for pharmaceutical dependency, though these considerations were never acknowledged in formal marriage planning discussions. The wedding preparations for addiction-affected families created elaborate logistical challenges that required coordination between pharmaceutical needs and social obligations, with backup planning for managing potential medical emergencies or consumption-related complications during high-visibility celebration events. Catherine Blackwood's wedding required pharmaceutical scheduling that ensured optimal presentation during ceremonial activities, while maintaining access to medication throughout extended celebration periods. Catherine's transition from her family home to her married residence required establishing new pharmaceutical supply networks and consumption routines that would function within different household arrangements, while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect her marriage and social reputation. Her success in concealing her addiction from her new husband while adapting to married life required sophisticated deception skills and careful management of domestic arrangements that accommodated her pharmaceutical needs without arousing suspicion. The honeymoon period created unique opportunities and challenges for newly married women managing pharmaceutical dependency, as travel requirements and intimate domestic arrangements with new husbands required adaptation of established consumption routines while maintaining romantic and social expectations appropriate for newlywed couples. Catherine's honeymoon correspondence reveals elaborate systems for maintaining pharmaceutical supplies during travel, while concealing consumption from her husband during their most intimate, early married experiences. The establishment of new households required addicted women to train servants, establish supplier relationships, and create domestic routines that supported their pharmaceutical needs, while maintaining appropriate married social appearances. Catherine's success in creating functional addiction required considerable married life, while managing serious intelligence, planning skills, and deceptive capability that demonstrated both her personal resourcefulness and the tragic waste of human potential that addiction represented. The generational patterns of addiction transmission within Victorian families created complex inheritance issues beyond simple financial considerations, as pharmaceutical dependency affected family decision-making capacity, asset management, and long-term planning in ways that had lasting consequences for multiple generations of family members. Mrs. Evangeline Blackwood's estate planning required careful consideration of her daughter Catherine's pharmaceutical expenses and decision-making capacity, creating legal and financial arrangements that protected family assets while accommodating addiction-related needs and limitations. Evangeline's will included elaborate trust arrangements that provided Catherine with access to funds for pharmaceutical expenses, while protecting the family's remaining assets from potential mismanagement due to addiction-impaired judgment. These legal innovations created templates for other addiction-affected families facing similar estate planning challenges, developing financial instruments that balanced family support with asset protection in ways that acknowledged addiction without explicitly naming it in legal documents. The legal profession serving upper-class families developed expertise in creating financial arrangements that addressed pharmaceutical dependency without creating legal documents that might expose family addiction issues to unwanted scrutiny or social embarrassment. Lawyers learned to draft wills, trusts, and financial agreements that provided ongoing support for addiction-related expenses while maintaining family privacy and protecting against potential legal challenges that might arise from addiction-impaired decision-making. The banking institutions that served wealthy Victorian families developed informal understanding of account patterns and financial behaviours that reflected pharmaceutical dependency among their clients, creating discrete services that accommodated unusual expense patterns and withdrawal requirements without requiring explicit acknowledgement of their underlying causes. Banks learned to provide financial services that supported addiction while maintaining customer privacy and institutional respectability. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton's banking relationships evolved to include discrete pharmaceutical financing arrangements that allowed her to maintain her consumption levels while protecting her family's broader financial interests from the economic impact of her escalating addiction expenses. Her banker, Mr. James Morrison, developed specialized knowledge of pharmaceutical markets and supply costs that allowed him to provide financial advice and services that supported her addiction while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries and institutional policies. The insurance industry that served upper-class families struggled to address pharmaceutical dependency issues that affected policy coverage, premium calculations, and claim assessments in ways that required acknowledgement of addiction without explicit documentation that might compromise family privacy or social standing. Insurance companies developed informal protocols for managing policies held by addiction-affected families, creating coverage arrangements that provided appropriate protection while avoiding explicit addiction documentation. The medical insurance innovations that began appearing in the 1880s created opportunities for addiction-affected families to obtain coverage for pharmaceutical expenses without explicit acknowledgement of dependency issues, as medical policies could frame laudanum consumption as legitimate treatment for various nervous conditions and feminine health problems. These insurance arrangements provided financial support for continued addiction while maintaining the medical fiction that pharmaceutical consumption represented therapeutic treatment rather than recreational dependency. The international finance networks that supported global commerce and family wealth management created opportunities for addiction-affected families to access pharmaceutical supplies and financial resources across national boundaries, developing complex arrangements that supported addiction while protecting family assets and reputations from potential exposure or legal complications related to drug consumption and international pharmaceutical commerce. Mrs. Charlotte Fairfax's international financial arrangements included discrete pharmaceutical financing that supported her access to imported opium preparations while maintaining appropriate legal compliance with customs regulations and international commerce requirements. Her financial advisors developed expertise in pharmaceutical commerce law that allowed them to structure legitimate business arrangements that supported her addiction while protecting her family from potential legal or financial exposure related to international drug trafficking or customs violations. The international connections that facilitated Victorian laudanum addiction extended far beyond simple commercial relationships to encompass elaborate social networks that spanned continents and cultures. When Lady Margaret Thornfield returned from her husband's diplomatic posting in Constantinople, she brought with her not only exotic silks and precious gems, but also knowledge of Ottoman pharmaceutical preparations that would transform London society's approach to opium consumption. Her Thursday afternoon gatherings became legendary among certain circles, where ladies would sample what she termed Eastern remedies, while discussing the latest literary works and charitable endeavours. Lady Margaret's drawing room transformed into an informal laboratory where she would demonstrate the preparation of Turkish opium wines and Persian tinctures that were far more potent than anything available through London's conventional pharmaceutical establishments. Her guests genuinely believed they were engaging in sophisticated cultural exchange, broadening their understanding of global medical practices, while maintaining the refined social discourse expected of their position. The exotic origins of these preparations provided perfect cover for experimentation with dramatically stronger substances, as their foreign nature suggested both authenticity and respectability. Mrs. Cordelia Whitmore's sister, residing in the British colony of India, became an unwitting accomplice in international pharmaceutical trafficking through what appeared to be innocent family correspondence. Cordelia's letters contained elaborate coded requests for what she described as medicinal curiosities and therapeutic specimens that would enhance her understanding of global medical practices. These innocent family exchanges actually facilitated the movement of raw opium across international borders, with packages arriving through normal postal channels containing carefully concealed quantities of substances that were both more potent and more affordable than anything available through legitimate British suppliers. The sophistication of these international networks reveals how thoroughly addiction had penetrated the upper echelons of British society. Women who would have been horrified by any association with criminal activity were unknowingly operating complex smuggling operations that moved enormous quantities of narcotics across continents, all while maintaining their reputations as pillars of moral society and cultural refinement. Their international connections provided access to pharmaceutical varieties and potencies that domestic suppliers could never match, creating addiction patterns that escalated far beyond what local medical supervision might have contained or controlled. The seasonal migrations of wealthy families between their various residences created additional logistical networks that supported and concealed pharmaceutical dependency on an international scale. Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell's annual continental tour required pharmaceutical planning that rivaled military supply operations in its complexity and precision. Her travelling arrangements included relationships with suppliers in Paris, Vienna, Rome, and Baden-Baden, creating a European network of pharmaceutical support that ensured continuous access to laudanum regardless of political upheavals, shipping delays, or customs complications that might disrupt normal commercial channels. Beatrice's lady's maid, Sarah Morrison, developed extraordinary expertise in international pharmaceutical logistics that made her invaluable not only to her employer, but to other society women planning similar continental travels. Sarah's knowledge of European customs regulations, supplier reliability, and cultural attitudes toward pharmaceutical consumption created opportunities for her to provide consulting services that operated through servant networks and family connections. Her informal business offered guidance on procurement strategies, legal requirements, and social considerations that affected pharmaceutical access across multiple countries and regulatory systems. The continental hotel industry, serving British society travellers, began recognising accommodation patterns among certain guests, whose requirements seemed unusually specific, and whose behaviour suggested medical conditions requiring special discretion and consideration. Hotel managers in fashionable resort areas developed services that addressed these pharmaceutical needs without explicit acknowledgement of their true nature, creating hospitality innovations that supported addiction while maintaining the social respectability essential to their clientele's continued patronage and referrals. The Grand Hotel in Baden-Baden became particularly renowned among British society women for its understanding approach to guests with delicate constitutions and complex medical requirements. The concierge services evolved to include pharmaceutical consulting and procurement assistance that served not just individual guests, but entire social networks of British women whose annual spa visits had become essential components of their addiction management strategies. The hotel's staff developed sophisticated understanding of British pharmaceutical preferences, supplier relationships, and consumption patterns that allowed them to provide seamless support for heavily addicted guests while maintaining the medical fiction that justified their elaborate chemical requirements. These international spa communities provided perfect environments for pharmaceutical experimentation and consumption escalation, as the medical justification for various treatments was integrated into the resort experience itself. Women could consume enormous quantities of different opiate preparations while maintaining the fiction that they were following prescribed therapeutic regimens designed to address legitimate health concerns. The international nature of these communities also provided anonymity that allowed for experimentation with dosages and combinations that might have raised concerns in their home social circles, where their normal consumption patterns were already established and monitored by familiar physicians and suppliers. The cultural exchange that occurred within these international pharmaceutical communities created opportunities for British women to learn about addiction management techniques and consumption cultural contexts. Mrs. Victoria strategies that had been developed in different Fairchild's regular visits to European spas exposed her to German approaches to opium consumption that emphasized precise timing and measurement, French techniques for combining laudanum with wine and other substances, and Italian methods for managing withdrawal symptoms during periods of forced abstinence. These international learning experiences enhanced her ability to manage her addiction, while providing cultural justification for increasingly sophisticated pharmaceutical consumption patterns. The scientific revolution, beginning to transform medicine in the late Victorian period, created new challenges for women whose addiction had been sustained through previous decades of medical ignorance and social acceptance. Dr. Alexander Morrison's groundbreaking research into opium dependency, published in 1881, marked one of the first serious medical attempts to understand addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing or evidence of refined feminine sensitivity. However, his work focused almost exclusively on male subjects, particularly soldiers who had become dependent on morphine for war injuries, leaving the epidemic among society women largely unstudied and medically misunderstood. As we close this tragic chapter of Victorian history, the stories of Eleanor Whitmore, Catherine Morrison, and countless other society women remind us that addiction has always been a hidden epidemic, transcending class boundaries and social expectations. These women, trapped between impossible societal demands and a substance that promised relief but delivered only deeper enslavement, represent thousands of untold stories buried beneath layers of Victorian propriety and shame. Their struggles with laudanum addiction reveal how society's most privileged can become its most vulnerable, and how the very structures meant to protect can become instruments of destruction. Next time you see a perfectly composed Victorian portrait, remember there might be more than meets the eye.